CHAPTER I of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton CHEKHOV, translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter I. The superintendent said to me, "I only keep you out of regard for your worthy father. But for that you would have been sent flying long ago." I replied to him, "You flatter me too much, your Excellency, in assuming that I am capable of flying." And then I heard him say, "Take that gentleman away. He gets upon my nerves." 2 days later I was dismissed. And in this way I have, during the years I have been regarded as grown up, lost 9 situations, to the great mortification of my father, the architect of our town. I have served in various departments, but all these 9 jobs have been as alike as one drop of water is to another. I had to sit, write, listen to rude or stupid observations, and go on doing so till I was dismissed. When I came in to my father, he was sitting buried in a low armchair with his eyes closed. His dry, emaciated face, with a shade of dark blue where it was shaved (he looked like an old Catholic organist), expressed meekness and resignation. Without responding to my greeting or opening his eyes, he said: "If my dear wife and your mother were living, your life would have been a source of continual distress to her. I see the divine providence in her premature death. I beg you, unhappy boy," he continued, opening his eyes, "tell me, what am I to do with you?" In the past, when I was younger, my friends and relations had known what to do with me. Some of them used to advise me to volunteer for the army, others to get a job in a pharmacy, and others in the telegraph department. Now that I am over 25, that grey hairs are beginning to show on my temples, and that I have been already in the army, and in a pharmacy, and in the telegraph department, it would seem that all earthly possibilities have been exhausted, and people have given up advising me, and merely sigh or shake their heads. "What do you think about yourself?" my father went on. "By the time they are your age, young men have a secure social position, while look at you! You are a proletarian, a beggar, a burden on your father." And as usual he proceeded to declare that the young people of today were on the road to perdition through infidelity, materialism, and self-conceit, and that amateur theatricals ought to be prohibited because they seduced young people from religion and their duties. "Tomorrow we shall go together, and you shall apologize to the superintendent and promise him to work conscientiously," he said in conclusion. "You ought not to remain one single day with no regular position in society." "I beg you to listen to me," I said sullenly, expecting nothing good from this conversation. "What you call a position in society is the privilege of capital and education. Those who have neither wealth nor education earn their daily bread by manual labour, and I see no grounds for my being an exception." "When you begin talking about manual labour, it is always stupid and vulgar," said my father with irritation. "Understand, you dense fellow, understand, you addle-pate, that besides coarse physical strength you have the divine spirit, a spark of the holy fire, which distinguishes you in the most striking way from the ass or the reptile and brings you nearer to the Deity. This fire is the fruit of the efforts of the best of mankind during thousands of years. Your great-grandfather Poloznev, the general, fought at Borodino. Your grandfather was a poet, an orator, and a marshal of nobility. Your uncle is a schoolmaster, and lastly I, your father, am an architect. All the Poloznevs have guarded the sacred fire for you to put it out." "One must be just," I said. "Millions of people put up with manual labour." "And let them put up with it. They don't know how to do anything else. Anybody, even the most abject fool or criminal, is capable of manual labour. Such labour is the distinguishing mark of the slave and the barbarian, while the holy fire is vouchsafed only to a few." To continue this conversation was unprofitable. My father worshipped himself, and nothing was convincing to him but what he said himself. Besides, I knew perfectly well that the disdain with which he talked of physical toil was founded not so much on reverence for the sacred fire as on a secret dread that I should become a workman and should set the whole town talking about me. What was worse, all my contemporaries had long ago taken their degrees and were getting on well, and the son of the manager of the State Bank was already a collegiate assessor, while I, his only son, was nothing. To continue the conversation was unprofitable and unpleasant, but I still sat on and feebly retorted, hoping that I might at last be understood. The whole question, of course, was clear and simple, and only concerned with the means of my earning my living. But the simplicity of it was not seen, and I was talked to in mawkishly rounded phrases of Borodino, of the sacred fire, of my uncle a forgotten poet who had once written poor and artificial verses. I was rudely called an addlepate and a dense fellow. And how I longed to be understood! In spite of everything, I loved my father and my sister, and it had been my habit from childhood to consult them, a habit so deeply rooted that I doubt whether I could ever have got rid of it. Whether I were in the right or the wrong, I was in constant dread of wounding them, constantly afraid that my father's thin neck would turn crimson and that he would have a stroke. "To sit in a stuffy room," I began, "to copy, to compete with a typewriter, is shameful and humiliating for a man of my age. What can the sacred fire have to do with it?" "It's intellectual work, anyway," said my father. "But that's enough. Let us cut short this conversation, and in any case I warn you, if you don't go back to your work again, but follow your contemptible propensities, then my daughter and I will banish you from our hearts. I shall strike you out of my will, I swear by the living God." With perfect sincerity, to prove the purity of the motives by which I wanted to be guided in all my doings, I said: "The question of inheritance does not seem very important to me. I shall renounce it all beforehand." For some reason or other, quite to my surprise, these words were deeply resented by my father. He turned crimson. "Don't dare to talk to me like that, stupid!" he shouted in a thin, shrill voice. "Wastrel!" And with a rapid, skilful, and habitual movement he slapped me twice in the face. "You are forgetting yourself." When my father beat me as a child, I had to stand up straight, with my hands held stiffly to my trouser seams, and look him straight in the face. And now when he hit me I was utterly overwhelmed, and, as though I were still a child, drew myself up and tried to look him in the face. My father was old and very thin, but his delicate muscles must have been as strong as leather, for his blows hurt a good deal. I staggered back into the passage, and there he snatched up his umbrella, and with it hit me several times on the head and shoulders. At that moment my sister opened the drawing room door to find out what the noise was, but at once turned away with a look of horror and pity without uttering a word in my defence. My determination not to return to the Government office, but to begin a new life of toil, was not to be shaken. All that was left for me to do was to fix upon the special employment, and there was no particular difficulty about that, as it seemed to me that I was very strong, and fitted for the very heaviest labour. I was faced with a monotonous life of toil in the midst of hunger, coarseness, and stench, continually preoccupied with earning my daily bread. And who knows? As I returned from my work along Great Dvoryansky Street, I might very likely enjoy Dolzhikov, the engineer, who lived by intellectual work, but at the moment, thinking over all my future hardships made me light hearted. At times I had dreamed of spiritual activity, imagining myself a teacher, a doctor, or a writer, but these dreams remained dreams. The taste for intellectual pleasures, for the theatre, for instance, and for writing, was a passion with me, but whether I had any ability for intellectual work I don't know. At school I had had an unconquerable aversion for Greek, so that I was only in the fourth class when they had to take me from school. For a long while I had coaches preparing me for the fifth class. Then I served in various government offices, spending the greater part of the day in complete idleness, and I was told that was intellectual work. My activity in the scholastic and official sphere had required neither mental application nor talent, nor special qualifications, nor creative impulse; it was mechanical. Such intellectual work I put on a lower level than physical toil. I despise it, and I don't think that for one moment it could serve as a justification for an idle, careless life, as it is indeed nothing but a sham, one of the forms of that same idleness. Real intellectual work I have in all probability never known. Evening came on. We lived in Great Dvoryansky Street. It was the principal street in the town, and in the absence of decent public gardens our beau monde used to use it as a promenade in the evenings. This charming street did to some extent take the place of a public garden, as on each side of it there was a row of poplars which smelt sweet, particularly after rain, and acacias, tall bushes of lilac, wild cherries, and apple trees hung over the fences and palings. The May twilight, the tender young greenery with its shifting shades, the scent of the lilac, the buzzing of the insects, the stillness, the warmth, how fresh and marvellous it all is, though spring is repeated every year. I stood at the garden gate and watched the passers by. With most of them I had grown up and at one time played pranks. Now they might have been disconcerted by my being near them, for I was poorly and unfashionably dressed, and they used to say of my very narrow trousers and huge clumsy boots that they were like sticks of macaroni stuck in boats. Besides, I had a bad reputation in the town because I had no decent social position, and used often to play billiards in cheap taverns, and also, perhaps, because I had on 2 occasions been hauled up before an officer of the police, though I had done nothing whatever to account for this. In the big house opposite someone was playing the piano at Dolzhikov's. It was beginning to get dark, and stars were twinkling in the sky. Here my father, in an old top hat with wide upturned brim, walked slowly by with my sister on his arm, bowing in response to greetings. "Look up," he said to my sister, pointing to the sky with the same umbrella with which he had beaten me that afternoon. "Look up at the sky. Even the tiniest stars are all worlds. How insignificant is man in comparison with the universe!" And he said this in a tone that suggested that it was particularly agreeable and flattering to him that he was so insignificant. How absolutely devoid of talent and imagination he was! Sad to say, he was the only architect in the town, and in the 15 to 20 years that I could remember, not one single decent house had been built in it. When anyone asked him to plan a house, he usually drew first the reception hall and drawing room, just as in old days the boarding house misses always started from the stove when they danced. So his artistic ideas could only begin and develop from the hall and drawing room. To them he tacked on a dining room, a nursery, a study, linking the rooms together with doors, and so they all inevitably turned into passages, and every one of them had 2 or even 3 unnecessary doors. His imagination must have been lacking in clearness, extremely muddled, curtailed. As though feeling that something was lacking, he invariably had recourse to all sorts of outbuildings, planting one beside another. And I can see now the narrow entries, the poky little passages, the crooked staircases leading to half landings, where one could not stand upright, and where, instead of a floor, there were 3 huge steps, like the shelves of a bath house. And the kitchen was invariably in the basement, with a brick floor and vaulted ceilings. The front of the house had a harsh, stubborn expression. The lines of it were stiff and timid. The roof was low pitched and, as it were, squashed down, and the fat, well-fed looking chimneys were invariably crowned by wire caps with squeaking black cowls. And for some reason all these houses, built by my father exactly like one another, vaguely reminded me of his top hat and the back of his head, stiff and stubborn looking. In the course of years they have grown used in the town to the poverty of my father's imagination. It has taken root and become our local style. This same style my father had brought into my sister's life also, beginning with christening her Cleopatra, just as he had named me Misail. When she was a little girl, he scared her by references to the stars, to the sages of ancient times, to our ancestors, and discoursed at length on the nature of life and duty. And now, when she was 26, he kept up the same habits, allowing her to walk arm in arm with no one but himself, and imagining, for some reason, that sooner or later a suitable young man would be sure to appear, and to desire to enter into matrimony with her from respect for his personal qualities. She adored my father, feared him, and believed in his exceptional intelligence. It was quite dark, and gradually the street grew empty. The music had ceased in the house opposite. The gate was thrown wide open, and a team with 3 horses trotted frolicking along our street with a soft tinkle of little bells. That was the engineer going for a drive with his daughter. It was bedtime. I had my own room in the house, but I lived in a shed in the yard, under the same roof as a brick barn which had been built some time or other, probably to keep harness in. Great hooks were driven into the wall. Now it was not wanted, and for the last 30 years my father had stowed away in it his newspapers, which for some reason he had bound in half-yearly volumes and allowed nobody to touch. Living here, I was less liable to be seen by my father and his visitors, and I fancied that if I did not live in a real room, and did not go into the house every day to dinner, my father's words that I was a burden upon him did not sound so offensive. My sister was waiting for me. Unseen by my father, she had brought me some supper. Not a very large slice of cold veal and a piece of bread. In our house such sayings as "a penny saved is a penny gained," and "take care of the pence and the pounds will take care of themselves," and so on, were frequently repeated, and my sister, weighed down by these vulgar maxims, did her utmost to cut down the expenses, and so we fared badly. Putting the plate on the table, she sat down on my bed and began to cry. "Misail," she said, "what a way to treat us!" She did not cover her face. Her tears dropped on her bosom and hands, and there was a look of distress on her face. She fell back on the pillow and abandoned herself to her tears, sobbing and quivering all over. "You have left the service again," she articulated. "Oh, how awful it is!" "But do understand, sister, do understand," I said, and I was overcome with despair because she was crying. As ill luck would have it, the kerosene in my little lamp was exhausted. It began to smoke and was on the point of going out, and the old hooks on the walls looked down sullenly, and their shadows flickered. "Have mercy on us," said my sister, sitting up. "Father is in terrible distress, and I am ill. I shall go out of my mind. What will become of you?" she said, sobbing and stretching out her arms to me. "I beg you, I implore you, for our dear mother's sake, I beg you to go back to the office." "I can't, Cleopatra," I said, feeling that a little more and I should give way. "I cannot." "Why not?" my sister went on. "Why not? Well, if you can't get on with the head, look out for another post. Why shouldn't you get a situation on the railway, for instance? I have just been talking to Aniuta Blagovo. She declares they would take you on the railway line, and even promised to try and get a post for you. For God's sake, Misail, think a little, think a little, I implore you." We talked a little longer, and I gave way. I said that the thought of a job on the railway that was being constructed had never occurred to me, and that if she liked I was ready to try it. She smiled joyfully through her tears and squeezed my hand, and then went on crying because she could not stop, while I went to the kitchen for some kerosene. End of chapter 1. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 2 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 2. Among the devoted supporters of amateur theatricals, concerts, and tableaux vivants for charitable objects, the Azhugins, who lived in their own house in Great Dvoryansky Street, took a foremost place. They always provided the room, and took upon themselves all the troublesome arrangements and the expenses. They were a family of wealthy landowners, who had an estate of some 9,000 acres in the district, and a capital house, but they did not care for the country, and lived winter and summer alike in the town. The family consisted of the mother, a tall, spare, refined lady, with short hair, a short jacket, and a flat-looking skirt in the English fashion, and 3 daughters, who, when they were spoken of, were called not by their names, but simply the eldest, the middle, and the youngest. They all had ugly, sharp chins, and were short-sighted and round-shouldered. They were dressed like their mother, they lisped disagreeably, and yet, in spite of that, infallibly took part in every performance, and were continually doing something with a charitable object: acting, reciting, singing. They were very serious and never smiled, and even in a musical comedy they played without the faintest trace of gaiety, with a business-like air, as though they were engaged in book-keeping. I loved our theatricals, especially the numerous, noisy, and rather incoherent rehearsals, after which they always gave a supper. In the choice of the plays and the distribution of the parts I had no hand at all. The post assigned to me lay behind the scenes. I painted the scenes, copied out the parts, prompted, made up the actors' faces; and I was entrusted, too, with various stage effects such as thunder, the singing of nightingales, and so on. Since I had no proper social position and no decent clothes, at the rehearsals I held aloof from the rest in the shadows of the wings, and maintained a shy silence. I painted the scenes at the Azhogins' either in the barn or in the yard. I was assisted by Andrey Ivanov, a house painter, or, as he called himself, a contractor for all kinds of house decorations. A tall, very thin, pale man of 50, with a hollow chest, with sunken temples, with blue rings round his eyes, rather terrible to look at, in fact. He was afflicted with some internal malady, and every autumn and spring people said that he wouldn't recover, but after being laid up for a while he would get up and say afterwards with surprise, "I have escaped dying again." In the town he was called Radish, and they declared that this was his real name. He was as fond of the theatre as I was, and as soon as rumours reached him that a performance was being got up, he threw aside all his work and went to the Azhogins' to paint scenes. The day after my talk with my sister I was working at the Azhogins' from morning till night. The rehearsal was fixed for 7 o'clock in the evening, and an hour before it began all the amateurs were gathered together in the hall, and the eldest, the middle, and the youngest Azhogins were pacing about the stage, reading from manuscript books. Radish, in a long rusty red overcoat and a scarf muffled round his neck, already stood leaning with his head against the wall, gazing with a devout expression at the stage. Madame Azhogin went up first to one and then to another guest, saying something agreeable to each. She had a way of gazing into one's face and speaking softly as though telling a secret. "It must be difficult to paint scenery," she said softly, coming up to me. "I was just talking to Madame Mufke about superstitions when I saw you come in. My goodness, my whole life I have been waging war against superstitions. To convince the servants what nonsense all their terrors are, I always light 3 candles, and begin all my important undertakings on the 13th of the month." Dolzhikov's daughter came in, a plump, fair beauty, dressed, as people said, in everything from Paris. She did not act, but a chair was set for her on the stage at the rehearsals, and the performances never began till she had appeared in the front row, dazzling and astounding every one with her fine clothes. As a product of the capital she was allowed to make remarks during the rehearsals, and she did so with a sweet, indulgent smile, and one could see that she looked upon our performance as a childish amusement. It was said she had studied singing at the Petersburg Conservatory, and even sang for a whole winter in a private opera. I thought her very charming, and I usually watched her through the rehearsals and performances without taking my eyes off her. I had just picked up the manuscript book to begin prompting when my sister suddenly made her appearance. Without taking off her cloak or hat, she came up to me and said, "Come along, I beg you." I went with her. Anyuta Blagovo, also in her hat and wearing a dark veil, was standing behind the scenes at the door. She was the daughter of the assistant president of the court, who had held that office in our town almost ever since the establishment of the circuit court. Since she was tall and had a good figure, her assistance was considered indispensable for tableaux vivants, and when she represented a fairy or something like Glory, her face burned with shame. But she took no part in dramatic performances, and came to the rehearsals only for a moment on some special errand, and did not go into the hall. Now, too, it was evident that she had only looked in for a minute. "My father was speaking about you," she said dryly, blushing and not looking at me. "Dolzhikov has promised you a post on the railway line. Apply to him to morrow; he will be at home." I bowed, and thanked her for the trouble she had taken. and you can give up this," she said, indicating the exercise book. My sister and she went up to Madame Azhogin, and for 2 minutes they were whispering with her looking towards me. They were consulting about something. "Yes, indeed," said Madame Azhogin, softly coming up to me and looking intently into my face. "Yes, indeed, if this distracts you from serious pursuits," she took the manuscript book from my hands, "you can hand it over to some one else. Don't distress yourself, my friend. Go home, and good luck to you." I said good bye to her, and went away overcome with confusion. As I went down the stairs I saw my sister and Anyuta Blagovo going away. They were hastening along, talking eagerly about something, probably about my going into the railway service. My sister had never been at a rehearsal before, and now she was most likely conscience-stricken, and afraid her father might find out that, without his permission, she had been to the Azhogins'. I went to Dolzhikov's the next day between 12 and 1. The footman conducted me into a very beautiful room, which was the engineer's drawing room, and at the same time his working study. Everything here was soft and elegant, and, for a man so unaccustomed to luxury as I was, it seemed strange. There were costly rugs, huge armchairs, bronzes, pictures, gold and plush frames. Among the photographs scattered about the walls there were very beautiful women, clever, lovely faces, easy attitudes. From the drawing room there was a door leading straight into the garden on to a verandah. One could see lilac trees. One could see a table laid for lunch, a number of bottles, a bouquet of roses. There was a fragrance of spring and expensive cigars, a fragrance of happiness, and everything seemed as though it would say, "Here is a man who has lived and laboured, and has attained at last the happiness possible on earth." The engineer's daughter was sitting at the writing table, reading a newspaper. "You have come to see my father?" she asked. "He is having a shower bath. He will be here directly. Please sit down and wait." I sat down. "I believe you live opposite?" she questioned me, after a brief silence. "Yes." "I am so bored that I watch you every day out of the window. You must excuse me," she went on, looking at the newspaper, "and I often see your sister. She always has such a look of kindness and concentration." Dolzhikov came in. He was rubbing his neck with a towel. "Papa, Monsieur Poloznev," said his daughter. "Yes, yes, Blagovo was telling me," he turned briskly to me without giving me his hand. "But listen, what can I give you? What sort of posts have I got? You are a queer set of people," he went on aloud, in a tone as though he were giving me a lecture. "A score of you keep coming to me every day. You imagine I am the head of a department. I am constructing a railway line, my friends. I have employment for heavy labour. I need mechanics, smiths, navvies, carpenters, well sinkers, and none of you can do anything but sit and write. You are all clerks." And he seemed to me to have the same air of happiness as his rugs and easy chairs. He was stout and healthy, ruddy cheeked and broad chested, in a print cotton shirt and full trousers like a toy china sledge driver. He had a curly round beard and not a single grey hair, a hooked nose, and clear, dark, guileless eyes. "What can you do?" he went on. "There is nothing you can do. I am an engineer. I am a man of an assured position. But before they gave me a railway line I was for years in harness. I have been a practical mechanic. For 2 years I worked in Belgium as an oiler. You can judge for yourself, my dear fellow. What kind of work can I offer you?" "Of course, that is so," I muttered in extreme confusion, unable to face his clear, guileless eyes. "Can you work the telegraph, anyway?" he asked after a moment's thought. "Yes, I have been a telegraph clerk." "Hm! Well, we will see then. Meanwhile, go to Dubetchnya. I have got a fellow there, but he is a wretched creature." "And what will my duties consist of?" I asked. "We shall see. Go there. Meanwhile I will make arrangements. Only please don't get drunk, and don't worry me with requests of any sort, or I shall send you packing." He turned away from me without even a nod. I bowed to him and his daughter, who was reading a newspaper, and went away. My heart felt so heavy that when my sister began asking me how the engineer had received me, I could not utter a single word. I got up early in the morning at sunrise to go to Dubetchnya. There was not a soul in our great Dvoryansky Street. Every one was asleep, and my footsteps rang out with a solitary, hollow sound. The poplars, covered with dew, filled the air with soft fragrance. I was sad, and did not want to go away from the town. I was fond of my native town; it seemed to be so beautiful and so snug. I loved the fresh greenery, the still, sunny morning, the chiming of our bells. But the people with whom I lived in this town were boring, alien to me, sometimes even repulsive. I did not like them nor understand them. I did not understand what these 65,000 people lived for and by. I knew that Kimry lived by boots, that Tula made samovars and guns, that Odessa was a seaport, but what our town was and what it did I did not know. Great Dvoryansky Street and the two other smartest streets lived on the interest of capital, or on salaries received by officials from the public treasury, but what the other 8 streets, which ran parallel for over 2 miles and vanished beyond the hills, lived upon, was always an insoluble riddle to me. And the way those people lived one is ashamed to describe. No garden, no theatre, no decent band. The public library and the club library were only visited by Jewish youths, so that the magazines and new books lay for months uncut. Rich and well-educated people slept in close, stuffy bedrooms, on wooden bedsteads infested with bugs. Their children were kept in revoltingly dirty rooms called nurseries, and the servants, even the old and respected ones, slept on the floor in the kitchen covered with rags. On ordinary days the houses smelt of beetroot soup, and on fast days of sturgeon cooked in sunflower oil. The food was not good, and the drinking water was unwholesome. In the town council, at the governor's, at the head priest's, on all sides in private houses, people had been saying for years and years that our town had not a good and cheap water supply, and that it was necessary to obtain a loan of 200,000 from the treasury for laying on water. Very rich people, of whom 3 dozen could have been counted up in our town, and who at times lost whole estates at cards, drank the polluted water too, and talked all their lives with great excitement of a loan for the water supply. And I did not understand that. It seemed to me that it would have been simpler to take the 200,000 out of their own pockets and lay it out on that object. I did not know one honest man in the town. My father took bribes, and imagined that they were given him out of respect for his moral qualities. At the high school, in order to be moved up rapidly from class to class, the boys went to board with their teachers, who charged them exorbitant sums. The wife of the military commander took bribes from the recruits when they were called up before the board, and even deigned to accept refreshments from them, and on one occasion could not get up from her knees in church because she was drunk. The doctors took bribes too when the recruits came up for examination, and the town doctor and the veterinary surgeon levied a regular tax on the butchers' shops and the restaurants. At the district school they did a trade in certificates, qualifying for partial exemption from military service. The higher clergy took bribes from the humbler priests and from the church elders. At the municipal, the artisans, and all the other boards, every petitioner was pursued by a shout, "Don't forget your thanks!" and the petitioner would turn back to give 6 pence or a shilling. And those who did not take bribes, such as the higher officials of the Department of Justice, were haughty, offering 2 fingers instead of shaking hands, were distinguished by the frigidity and narrowness of their judgments, spent a great deal of time over cards, drank to excess, married heiresses, and undoubtedly had a pernicious, corrupting influence on those around them. It was only the girls who had still the fresh fragrance of moral purity. Most of them had higher impulses, pure and honest hearts, but they had no understanding of life, and believed that bribes were given out of respect for moral qualities, and after they were married grew old quickly, let themselves go completely, and sank hopelessly in the mire of vulgar, petty, bourgeois existence. End of chapter 2. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 3 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 3. A railway line was being constructed in our neighborhood. On the eve of feast days the streets were thronged with ragged fellows whom the townspeople called navvies, and of whom they were afraid. And more than once I had seen one of these tatterdemalions, with a blood-stained countenance, being led to the police station, while a samovar or some linen wet from the wash was carried behind by way of material evidence. The navvies usually congregated about the taverns in the market-place. They drank, ate, and used bad language, and pursued with shrill whistles every woman of light behaviour who passed by. To entertain this hungry rabble, our shopkeepers made cats and dogs drunk with vodka, or tied an old kerosene can to a dog's tail. A hue and cry was raised, and the dog dashed along the street, jingling the can, squealing with terror. It fancied some monster was close upon its heels. It would run far out of the town into the open country, and there sink exhausted. There were in the town several dogs who went about trembling with their tails between their legs, and people said this diversion had been too much for them and had driven them mad. A station was being built 4 miles from the town. It was said that the engineers asked for a bribe of 50,000 roubles for bringing the line right up to the town, but the town council would only consent to give 40,000. They could not come to an agreement over the difference, and now the townspeople regretted it, as they had to make a road to the station, and that, it was reckoned, would cost more. The sleepers and rails had been laid throughout the whole length of the line, and trains ran up and down it, bringing building materials and labourers, and further progress was only delayed on account of the bridges which Dolzhikov was building, and some of the stations were not yet finished. Dubetchnya, as our first station was called, was a little under 12 miles from the town. I walked. The cornfields, bathed in the morning sunshine, were bright green. It was a flat, cheerful country, and in the distance there were the distinct outlines of the station, of ancient barrows, and far-away homesteads. How nice it was out there in the open! And how I longed to be filled with a sense of freedom, if only for that one morning, that I might not think of what was being done in the town, not think of my needs, not feel hungry. Nothing has so marred my existence as an acute feeling of hunger, which made images of buckwheat porridge, rissoles, and baked fish mingle strangely with my best thoughts. Here I was standing alone in the open country, gazing upward at a lark which hovered in the air at the same spot, trilling as though in hysterics, and meanwhile I was thinking how nice it would be to eat a piece of bread and butter. Or I would sit down by the roadside to rest, and shut my eyes to listen to the delicious sounds of May, and what haunted me was the smell of hot potatoes. Though I was tall and strongly built, I had as a rule little to eat, and so the predominant sensation throughout the day was hunger, and perhaps that was why I knew so well how it is that such multitudes of people toil merely for their daily bread, and can talk of nothing but things to eat. At Dubetchnya they were plastering the inside of the station, and building a wooden upper storey to the pumping shed. It was hot. There was a smell of lime, and the workmen sauntered listlessly between the heaps of shavings and mortar rubble. The pointsman lay asleep near his sentry box, and the sun was blazing full on his face. There was not a single tree. The telegraph wire hummed faintly, and hawks were perching on it here and there. I, wandering too among the heaps of rubbish, and not knowing what to do, recalled how the engineer, in answer to my question what my duties would consist in, had said, "We shall see when you are there." But what could one see in that wilderness? The plasterers spoke of the foreman and of a certain Fyodor Vassilief. I did not understand, and gradually I was overcome by depression, the physical depression in which one is conscious of one's arms and legs and huge body, and does not know what to do with them or where to put them. After I had been walking about for at least a couple of hours, I noticed that there were telegraph poles running off to the right from the station, and that they ended a mile or a mile and a half away at a white stone wall. The workmen told me the office was there, and at last I reflected that that was where I ought to go. It was a very old manor house, deserted long ago. The wall round it, of porous white stone, was mouldering and had fallen away in places, and the lodge, the blank wall of which looked out on the open country, had a rusty roof with patches of tin plate gleaming here and there on it. Within the gates could be seen a spacious courtyard, overgrown with rough weeds, and an old manor house with sun-blinds on the windows, and a high roof red with rust. Two lodges, exactly alike, stood one on each side of the house, to right and to left. One had its windows nailed up with boards. Near the other, of which the windows were open, there was washing on the line, and there were calves moving about. The last of the telegraph poles stood in the courtyard, and the wire from it ran to the window of the lodge, of which the blank wall looked out into the open country. The door stood open. I went in. By the telegraph apparatus a gentleman with a curly dark head, wearing a reefer coat made of sailcloth, was sitting at a table. He glanced at me morosely from under his brows, but immediately smiled and said, "Hullo, better than nothing!" It was Ivan Tcheprakov, an old schoolfellow of mine, who had been expelled from the second class for smoking. We used at one time during autumn to catch goldfinches, finches, and linnets together, and to sell them in the market early in the morning, while our parents were still in their beds. We watched for flocks of migrating starlings and shot at them with small shot. Then we picked up those that were wounded, and some of them died in our hands in terrible agonies. I remember to this day how they moaned in the cage at night. Those that recovered we sold, and swore with the utmost effrontery that they were all cocks. On one occasion at the market I had only one starling left, which I had offered to purchasers in vain, till at last I sold it for a farthing. "Anyway, it's better than nothing," I said to comfort myself as I put the farthing in my pocket, and from that day the street urchins and the schoolboys called after me, "Better than nothing," and to this day the street boys and the shopkeepers mock at me with the nickname, though no one remembers how it arose. Tcheprakov was not of robust constitution. He was narrow-chested, round-shouldered, and long-legged. He wore a silk cord for a tie, had no trace of a waistcoat, and his boots were worse than mine, with the heels trodden down on one side. He stared, hardly even blinking, with a strained expression, as though he were just going to catch something, and he was always in a fuss. "You wait a minute," he would say fussily. "You listen. Whatever was I talking about?" We got into conversation. I learned that the estate on which I now was had until recently been the property of the Tcheprakovs, and had only the autumn before passed into the possession of Dolzhikov, who considered it more profitable to put his money into land than to keep it in notes, and had already bought up 3 good-sized mortgaged estates in our neighbourhood. At the sale, Tcheprakov's mother had reserved for herself the right to live for the next 2 years in one of the lodges at the side, and had obtained a post for her son in the office. "I should think he could buy," Tcheprakov said of the engineer. "See what he fleeces out of the contractors alone. He fleeces every one." Then he took me to dinner, deciding fussily that I should live with him in the lodge and have my meals from his mother. "She is a bit stingy," he said, "but she won't charge you much." It was very cramped in the little rooms in which his mother lived. They were all, even the passage and the entry, piled up with furniture which had been brought from the big house after the sale, and the furniture was all old-fashioned mahogany. Madame Tcheprakov, a very stout middle-aged lady with slanting Chinese eyes, was sitting in a big armchair by the window, knitting a stocking. She received me ceremoniously. "This is Poloznov, mamma." Tcheprakov introduced me. "He is going to serve here." "Are you a nobleman?" she asked in a strange, disagreeable voice. It seemed to me to sound as though fat were bubbling in her throat. "Yes," I answered. "Sit down." The dinner was a poor one. Nothing was served but pies filled with bitter curd and milk soup. Elena Nikiforovna, who presided, kept blinking in a queer way, first with one eye and then with the other. She talked, she ate, but yet there was something deathly about her whole figure, and one almost fancied the faint smell of a corpse. There was only a glimmer of life in her, a glimmer of consciousness that she had been a lady who had once had her own serfs, that she was the widow of a general whom the servants had to address as "Your Excellency," and when these feeble relics of life flickered up in her for an instant, she would say to her son, "Jean, you are not holding your knife properly." Or she would say to me, drawing a deep breath, with the mincing air of a hostess trying to entertain a visitor, "You know we have sold our estate. Of course, it is a pity; we are used to the place, but Dolzhikov has promised to make Jean station master of Dubetchnya, so we shall not have to go away. We shall live here at the station, and that is just the same as being on our own property. The engineer is so nice. Don't you think he is very handsome?" Until recently the Tcheprakovs had lived in a wealthy style, but since the death of the general everything had been changed. Elena Nikiforovna had taken to quarrelling with the neighbours, to going to law, and to not paying her bailiffs or her labourers. She was in constant terror of being robbed, and in some 10 years Dubetchnya had become unrecognisable. Behind the great house was an old garden which had already run wild, and was overgrown with rough weeds and bushes. I walked up and down the verandah, which was still solid and beautiful. Through the glass doors one could see a room with parquetted floor, probably the drawing room, an old-fashioned piano, and pictures in deep mahogany frames. There was nothing else. In the old flower beds all that remained were peonies and poppies, which lifted their white and bright red heads above the grass. Young maples and elms, already nibbled by the cows, grew beside the paths, drawn up and hindering each other's growth. The garden was thickly overgrown and seemed impassable, but this was only near the house, where there stood poplars, fir trees, and old lime trees, all of the same age, relics of the former avenues. Further on, beyond them, the garden had been cleared for the sake of hay, and here it was not moist and stuffy, and there were no spiders' webs in one's mouth and eyes. A light breeze was blowing. The further one went, the more open it was. And here in the open space were cherries, plums, and spreading apple trees, disfigured by props and by canker. And pear trees were so tall that one could not believe they were pear trees. This part of the garden was let to some shopkeepers of the town, and it was protected from thieves and starlings by a feeble-minded peasant who lived in a shanty in it. The garden, growing more and more open till it became definitely a meadow, sloped down to the river, which was overgrown with green weeds and osiers. Near the mill dam was the mill pond, deep and full of fish. A little mill with a thatched roof was working away with a wrathful sound, and frogs croaked furiously. Circles passed from time to time over the smooth, mirror-like water, and the water lilies trembled, stirred by the lively fish. On the further side of the river was the little village Dubetchnya. The still, blue mill pond was alluring with its promise of coolness and peace. And now all this, the mill pond and the mill and the snug-looking banks, belonged to the engineer. And so my new work began. I received and forwarded telegrams, wrote various reports, and made fair copies of the notes of requirements, the complaints, and the reports sent to the office by the illiterate foremen and workmen. But for the greater part of the day I did nothing but walk about the room waiting for telegrams, or made a boy sit in the lodge while I went for a walk in the garden, until the boy ran to tell me that there was a tapping at the operating machine. I had dinner at Madame Tcheprakov's. Meat we had very rarely; our dishes were all made of milk, and Wednesdays and Fridays were fast days, and on those days we had pink plates which were called Lenten plates. Madame Tcheprakov was continually blinking; it was her invariable habit, and I always felt ill at ease in her presence. As there was not enough work in the lodge for one, Tcheprakov did nothing, but simply dozed, or went with his gun to shoot ducks on the mill pond. In the evenings he drank too much in the village or the station, and before going to bed stared in the looking-glass and said, "Hullo, Ivan Tcheprakov." When he was drunk he was very pale, and kept rubbing his hands and laughing with a sound like a neigh. "He he he!" By way of bravado he used to strip and run about the country naked. He used to eat flies and say they were rather sour. End of chapter 3. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 4 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 4. One day after dinner he ran breathless into the lodge and said, "Go along, your sister has come." I went out, and there I found a hired brake from the town standing before the entrance of the great house. My sister had come in it with Aniuta Blagovo and a gentleman in a military tunic. Going up closer, I recognized the latter. It was the brother of Aniuta Blagovo, the army doctor. "We have come to you for a picnic," he said. "Is that all right?" My sister and Aniuta wanted to ask how I was getting on here, but both were silent and simply gazed at me. I was silent too. They saw that I did not like the place, and tears came into my sister's eyes, while Aniuta Blagovo turned crimson. We went into the garden. The doctor walked ahead of us all and said enthusiastically: "What air! Holy Mother, what air!" In appearance he was still a student, and he walked and talked like a student, and the expression of his grey eyes was as keen, honest, and frank as a nice student's. Beside his tall and handsome sister he looked frail and thin, and his beard was thin too, and his voice too was a thin but rather agreeable tenor. He was serving in a regiment somewhere, and had come home to his people for a holiday, and said he was going in the autumn to Petersburg for his examination as a doctor of medicine. He was already a family man, with a wife and 3 children. He had married very young, in his second year at the university, and now people in the town said he was unhappy in his family life and was not living with his wife. "What time is it?" my sister asked uneasily. "We must get back in good time. Papa let me come to see my brother on condition I was back at 6." "Oh, bother your papa!" sighed the doctor. I set the samovar. We put down a carpet before the veranda of the great house and had our tea there, and the doctor knelt down, drank out of his saucer, and declared that he now knew what bliss was. Then Tcheprakov came with the key and opened the glass door, and we all went into the house. There it was half dark and mysterious, and smelt of mushrooms, and our footsteps had a hollow sound as though there were cellars under the floor. The doctor stopped and touched the keys of the piano, and it responded faintly with a husky, quivering, but melodious chord. He tried his voice and sang a song, frowning and tapping impatiently with his foot when some note was mute. My sister did not talk about going home, but walked about the rooms and kept saying, "How happy I am! How happy I am!" There was a note of astonishment in her voice, as though it seemed to her incredible that she, too, could feel light‐hearted. It was the first time in my life I had seen her so happy. She actually looked prettier. In profile she did not look nice; her nose and mouth seemed to stick out, and had an expression as though she were pouting. But she had beautiful dark eyes, a pale, very delicate complexion, and a touching expression of goodness and melancholy, and when she talked she seemed charming and even beautiful. We both, she and I, took after our mother, were broad-shouldered, strongly built, and capable of endurance, but her pallor was a sign of ill health. She often had a cough, and I sometimes caught in her face that look one sees in people who are seriously ill, but for some reason conceal the fact. There was something naïve and childish in her gaiety now, as though the joy that had been suppressed and smothered in our childhood by harsh education had now suddenly awakened in her soul and found a free outlet. But when evening came on and the horses were brought round, my sister sank into silence and looked thin and shrunken, and she got into the brake as though she were going to the scaffold. When they had all gone and the sound had died away, I remembered that Aniuta Blagovo had not said a word to me all day. "She is a wonderful girl," I thought. "Wonderful girl." St. Peter's fast came, and we had nothing but Lenten dishes every day. I was weighed down by physical depression, due to idleness and my unsettled position, and dissatisfied with myself. Listless and hungry, I lounged about the garden and only waited for a suitable mood to go away. Towards evening one day, when Radish was sitting in the lodge, Dolzhikov, very sunburnt and grey with dust, walked in unexpectedly. He had been spending 3 days on his land, and had come now to Dubetchnya by the steamer, and walked to us from the station. While waiting for the carriage, which was to come for him from the town, he walked round the grounds with his bailiff, giving orders in a loud voice, then sat for a whole hour in our lodge writing letters. While he was there, telegrams came for him, and he himself tapped off the answers. We three stood in silence at attention. "What a muddle!" he said, glancing contemptuously at a record book. "In a fortnight I am transferring the office to the station, and I don't know what I am to do with you, my friends." "I do my best, your honour," said Tcheprakov. "Oh, to be sure, I see how you do your best. The only thing you can do is to take your salary," the engineer went on, looking at me. "You keep relying on patronage to faire la carrière as quickly and as easily as possible. Well, I don't care for patronage. No one took any trouble on my behalf. Before they gave me a railway contract I went about as a mechanic, and worked in Belgium as an oiler. And you, Panteley, what are you doing here?" he asked, turning to Radish. "Drinking with them?" He, for some reason, always called humble people Panteley, and such as me and Tcheprakov he despised, and called them drunkards, beasts, and rabble to their faces. Altogether he was cruel to humble subordinates, and used to fine them and turn them off coldly without explanations. At last the horses came for him. As he said good-bye, he promised to turn us all off in a fortnight. He called his bailiff a blockhead, and then, lolling at ease in his carriage, drove back to the town. "Andrey Ivanitch," I said to Radish, "take me on as a workman." "Oh, all right." And we set off together in the direction of the town. When the station and the big house with its buildings were left behind, I asked: "Andrey Ivanitch, why did you come to Dubetchnya this evening?" "In the first place, my fellows are working on the line, and in the second place I came to pay the general's lady my interest. Last year I borrowed 50 roubles from her, and I pay her now a rouble a month interest." The painter stopped and took me by the button. "Misail Alexeyitch, our angel," he went on, "the way I look at it is that if any man, gentle or simple, takes even the smallest interest, he is doing evil. There cannot be truth and justice in such a man." Radish, lean, pale, dreadful looking, shut his eyes, shook his head, and in the tone of a philosopher pronounced: "Lice consume the grass, rust consumes the iron, and lying the soul. Lord, have mercy upon us sinners." End of chapter 4. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 5 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 5. Radish was not practical, and was not at all good at forming an estimate. He took more work than he could get through, and when calculating he was agitated, lost his head, and so was almost always out of pocket over his jobs. He undertook painting, glazing, paper hanging, and even tiling roofs, and I can remember his running about for 3 days to find tilers for the sake of a paltry job. He was a first-rate workman. He sometimes earned as much as 10 roubles a day, and if it had not been for the desire at all costs to be a master and to be called a contractor, he would probably have had plenty of money. He was paid by the job, but he paid me and the other workmen by the day, from 1 and 2 to 2 shillings a day. When it was fine and dry we did all kinds of outside work, chiefly painting roofs. When I was new to the work it made my feet burn as though I were walking on hot bricks, and when I put on felt boots they were hotter than ever. But this was only at first. Later on I got used to it, and everything went swimmingly. I was living now among people to whom labour was obligatory, inevitable, and who worked like cart horses, often with no idea of the moral significance of labour, and indeed never using the word labour in conversation at all. Beside them I, too, felt like a cart horse, growing more and more imbued with the feeling of the obligatory and inevitable character of what I was doing, and this made my life easier, setting me free from all doubt and uncertainty. At first everything interested me, everything was new, as though I had been born again. I could sleep on the ground and go about barefoot, and that was extremely pleasant. I could stand in a crowd of the common people and be no constraint to any one, and when a cab horse fell down in the street I ran to help it up without being afraid of soiling my clothes. And the best of it all was I was living on my own account and no burden to any one. Painting roofs, especially with our own oil and colours, was regarded as a particularly profitable job, and so this rough, dull work was not disdained even by such good workmen as Radish. In short breeches and wasted, purple-looking legs, he used to go about the roofs looking like a stork, and I used to hear him, as he plied his brush, breathing heavily and saying, "Woe, woe to us sinners!" He walked about the roofs as freely as though he were upon the ground. In spite of his being ill and pale as a corpse, his agility was extraordinary. He used to paint the domes and cupolas of the churches without scaffolding, like a young man, with only the help of a ladder and a rope, and it was rather horrible when standing on a height far from the earth. He would draw himself up erect and for some unknown reason pronounce "Lice consume grass, rust consumes iron, and lying the soul." Or, thinking about something, would answer his thoughts aloud: "Anything may happen, anything may happen." When I went home from my work, all the people who were sitting on benches by the gates, all the shopmen and boys and their employers, made sneering and spiteful remarks after me, and this upset me at first and seemed to be simply monstrous. "Better than nothing," I heard on all sides, "house painter," "yellow ochre," and none behaved so ungraciously to me as those who had only lately been humble people themselves, and had earned their bread by hard manual labour. In the streets full of shops I was once passing an ironmonger's when water was thrown over me as though by accident, and on one occasion some one darted out with a stick at me, while a fishmonger, a grey-headed old man, barred my way, and said, looking at me angrily, "I am not sorry for you, you fool. It's your father I am sorry for." And my acquaintances were for some reason overcome with embarrassment when they met me. Some of them looked upon me as a queer fish and a comic fool, others were sorry for me, others did not know what attitude to take up to me, and it was difficult to make them out. One day I met Anyuta Blagovo in a side street near Great Dvoryansky Street. I was going to work and was carrying two long brushes and a pail of paint. Recognizing me, Anyuta flushed crimson. "Please do not bow to me in the street," she said nervously, harshly, and in a shaking voice, without offering me her hand, and tears suddenly gleamed in her eyes. "If to your mind all this is necessary, so be it. So be it, but I beg you not to meet me." I no longer lived in Great Dvoryansky Street, but in the suburb with my old nurse Karpovna, a good-natured but gloomy old woman who always foreboded some harm, was afraid of all dreams, and even in the bees and wasps that flew into her room saw omens of evil. And the fact that I had become a workman, to her thinking, boded nothing good. "Your life is ruined," she would say, mournfully shaking her head. "Ruined." Her adopted son, Prokofy, a huge, uncouth, red-headed fellow of 30, with bristling moustaches, a butcher by trade, lived in the little house with her. When he met me in the passage he would make way for me in respectful silence, and if he was drunk he would salute me with all five fingers at once. He used to have supper in the evening, and through the partition wall of boards I could hear him clear his throat and sigh as he drank off glass after glass. "Mamma," he would call in an undertone. "Well?" Karpovna, who was passionately devoted to her adopted son, would respond. "What is it, sonny?" "I can show you a testimony of my affection, Mamma. All this earthly life I will cherish you in your declining years in this vale of tears, and when you die I will bury you at my expense. I have said it, and you can believe it." I got up every morning before sunrise and went to bed early. We house painters ate a great deal and slept soundly. The only thing amiss was that my heart used to beat violently at night. I did not quarrel with my mates. Violent abuse, desperate oaths, and wishes such as "blast your eyes" or "cholera take you" never ceased all day, but nevertheless we lived on very friendly terms. The other fellows suspected me of being some sort of religious sectary, and made good-natured jokes at my expense, saying that even my own father had disowned me, and thereupon would add that they rarely went into the temple of God themselves, and that many of them had not been to confession for 10 years. They justified this laxity on their part by saying that a painter among men was like a jackdaw among birds. The men had a good opinion of me and treated me with respect. It was evident that my not drinking, not smoking, but leading a quiet, steady life pleased them very much. It was only an unpleasant shock to them that I took no hand in stealing oil, and did not go with them to ask for tips from people on whose property we were working. Stealing oil and paints from those who employed them was a house painter's custom, and was not regarded as theft. And it was remarkable that even so upright a man as Radish would always carry away a little white lead and oil as he went home after work. And even the most respectable old fellows, who owned the houses in which they lived in the suburb, were not ashamed to ask for a tip. and it made me feel vexed and ashamed to see the men go in a body to congratulate some nonentity on the commencement or the completion of the job, and thank him with degrading servility when they had received a few coppers. With people on whose work they were engaged they behaved like wily courtiers, and almost every day I was reminded of Shakespeare's Polonius. "I fancy it is going to rain," the man whose house was being painted would say, looking at the sky. "It is, there is not a doubt it is," the painters would agree. "I don't think it is a rain cloud, though. Perhaps it won't rain after all." "No, it won't, your honour. I am sure it won't." But their attitude to their patrons behind their backs was usually one of irony. And when they saw, for instance, a gentleman sitting in the verandah reading a newspaper, they would observe, "He reads the paper, but I dare say he has nothing to eat." I never went home to see my own people. When I came back from work I often found waiting for me little notes, brief and anxious, in which my sister wrote to me about my father: that he had been particularly preoccupied at dinner and had eaten nothing, or that he had been giddy and staggering, or that he had locked himself in his room and had not come out for a long time. Such items of news troubled me. I could not sleep, and at times even walked up and down Great Dvoryansky Street at night by our house, looking in at the dark windows and trying to guess whether everything was well at home. On Sundays my sister came to see me, but came in secret, as though it were not to see me but our nurse. And if she came in to see me she was very pale, with tear-stained eyes, and she began crying at once. "Our father will never live through this," she would say. "If anything should happen to him, God grant it may not, your conscience will torment you all your life. It's awful, Misail. For our mother's sake, I beseech you, reform your ways." "My darling sister," I would say, "how can I reform my ways if I am convinced that I am acting in accordance with my conscience? Do understand." "I know you are acting on your conscience, but perhaps it could be done differently somehow, so as not to wound anybody." "Ah, holy saints!" the old woman sighed through the door. "Your life is ruined. There will be trouble, my dears, there will be trouble." End of chapter 5. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 6 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 6. One day Dr. Blagovo turned up unexpectedly. He was wearing a military tunic over a silk shirt and high boots of patent leather. "I have come to see you," he began, shaking my hand heartily, like a student. "I am hearing about you every day, and I have been meaning to come and have a heart-to-heart talk, as they say. The boredom in the town is awful. There is not a living soul, no one to say a word to. It's hot, Holy Mother," he went on, taking off his tunic and sitting in his silk shirt. "My dear fellow, let me talk to you." I was dull myself, and had for a long time been craving for the society of someone not a house painter. I was genuinely glad to see him. "I'll begin by saying," he said, sitting down on my bed, "that I sympathize with you from the bottom of my heart, and deeply respect the life you are leading. They don't understand you here in the town, and indeed there is no one to understand, seeing that, as you know, they are all, with very few exceptions, regular Gogolesque pig faces here. But I saw what you were at once that time at the picnic. You are a noble soul, an honest, high-minded man. I respect you, and feel it a great honour to shake hands with you," he went on enthusiastically. "To have made such a complete and violent change of life as you have done, you must have passed through a complicated spiritual crisis, and to continue this manner of life now, and to keep up to the high standard of your convictions continually, must be a strain on your mind and heart from day to day. Now, to begin our talk, tell me, don't you consider that if you had spent your strength of will, this strained activity, all these powers on something else, for instance, on gradually becoming a great scientist or artist, your life would have been broader and deeper and would have been more productive?" We talked, and when we got upon manual labour I expressed this idea: that what is wanted is that the strong should not enslave the weak, that the minority should not be a parasite on the majority, nor a vampire for ever sucking its vital sap. That is, all, without exception, strong and weak, rich and poor, should take part equally in the struggle for existence, each one on his own account, and that there was no better means for equalizing things in that way than manual labour, in the form of universal service, compulsory for all. "Then do you think every one without exception ought to engage in manual labour?" asked the doctor. "Yes." "And don't you think that if every one, including the best men, the thinkers and great scientists, taking part in the struggle for existence, each on his own account, are going to waste their time breaking stones and painting roofs, may not that threaten a grave danger to progress?" "Where is the danger?" I asked. "Why, progress is in deeds of love, in fulfilling the moral law. If you don't enslave anyone, if you don't oppress anyone, what further progress do you want?" "But excuse me," Blagovo suddenly fired up, rising to his feet, "but excuse me. If a snail in its shell busies itself over perfecting its own personality and muddles about with the moral law, do you call that progress?" "Why muddles?" I said, offended. "If you don't force your neighbour to feed and clothe you, to transport you from place to place, and defend you from your enemies, surely in the midst of a life entirely resting on slavery, that is progress, isn't it? To my mind it is the most important progress, and perhaps the only one possible and necessary for man. The limits of universal world progress are in infinity, and to talk of some possible progress limited by our needs and temporary theories is, excuse my saying so, positively strange." "If the limits of progress are in infinity, as you say, it follows that its aims are not definite," I said. "To live without knowing definitely what you are living for." "So be it. But that not knowing is not so dull as your knowing. I am going up a ladder which is called progress, civilisation, culture. I go on and up without knowing definitely where I am going, but really it is worth living for the sake of that delightful ladder. While you know what you are living for, you live for the sake of some people's not enslaving others, that the artist and the man who rubs his paints may dine equally well. But you know that's the petty bourgeois kitchen grey side of life, and surely it is revolting to live for that alone. If some insects do enslave others, bother them, let them devour each other. We need not think about them. You know they will die and decay just the same, however zealously you rescue them from slavery. We must think of that great millennium which awaits humanity in the remote future." Blagovo argued warmly with me, but at the same time one could see he was troubled by some irrelevant idea. "I suppose your sister is not coming?" he said, looking at his watch. "She was at our house yesterday, and said she would be seeing you to day. You keep saying slavery, slavery," he went on, "but you know that is a special question, and all such questions are solved by humanity gradually." We began talking of doing things gradually. I said that the question of doing good or evil every one settles for himself, without waiting till humanity settles it by the way of gradual development. Moreover, this gradual process has more than one aspect. Side by side with the gradual development of human ideas, the gradual growth of ideas of another order is observed. Serfdom is no more, but the capitalist system is growing. And in the very heyday of emancipating ideas, just as in the days of Bati, the majority feeds, clothes, and defends the minority while remaining hungry, inadequately clad, and defenceless. Such an order of things can be made to fit in finely without any tendencies and currents of thought you like, because the art of enslaving is also gradually being cultivated. We no longer flog our servants in the stable, but we give to slavery refined forms, at least, we succeed in finding a justification for it in each particular case. Ideas are ideas with us, but if now, at the end of the 19th century, it were possible to lay the burden of the most unpleasant of our physiological functions upon the working class, we should certainly do so, and afterwards, of course, justify ourselves by saying that if the best people, the thinkers and great scientists, were to waste their precious time on these functions, progress might be menaced with great danger. But at this point my sister arrived. Seeing the doctor, she was fluttered and troubled, and began saying immediately that it was time for her to go home to her father. "Cleopatra Alexeyevna," said Blagovo earnestly, pressing both hands to his heart, "what will happen to your father if you spend half an hour or so with your brother and me?" He was frank, and knew how to communicate his liveliness to others. After a moment's thought my sister laughed, and all at once became suddenly gay, as she had been at the picnic. We went out into the country, and lying in the grass went on with our talk, and looked towards the town where all the windows facing west were like glittering gold because the sun was setting. After that, whenever my sister was coming to see me, Blagovo turned up too, and they always greeted each other as though their meeting in my room was accidental. My sister listened while the doctor and I argued, and at such times her expression was joyfully enthusiastic, full of tenderness and curiosity, and it seemed to me that a new world she had never dreamed of before, and which she was now striving to fathom, was gradually opening before her eyes. When the doctor was not there she was quiet and sad, and now if she sometimes shed tears as she sat on my bed, it was for reasons of which she did not speak. In August, Radish ordered us to be ready to go to the railway line. 2 days before we were banished from the town, my father came to see me. He sat down and in a leisurely way, without looking at me, wiped his red face, then took out of his pocket our town messenger, and deliberately, with emphasis on each word, read out the news that the son of the branch manager of the State Bank, a young man of my age, had been appointed head of a department in the Exchequer. "And now look at you," he said, folding up the newspaper, "a beggar, in rags, good for nothing. Even working class people and peasants obtain education in order to become men, while you, a Poloznev, with ancestors of rank and distinction, aspire to the gutter. But I have not come here to talk to you. I have washed my hands of you," he added in a stifled voice, getting up. "I have come to find out where your sister is, you worthless fellow. She left home after dinner, and here it is nearly 8 and she is not back. She has taken to going out frequently without telling me. She is less dutiful, and I see in it your evil and degrading influence. Where is she?" In his hand he had the umbrella I knew so well, and I was already flustered and drew myself up like a schoolboy, expecting my father to begin hitting me with it, but he noticed my glance at the umbrella, and most likely that restrained him. "Live as you please," he said. "I shall not give you my blessing." "Holy saints!" my nurse muttered behind the door. "You poor, unlucky child! Ah, my heart bodes ill." I worked on the railway line. It rained without stopping all August; it was damp and cold. They had not carried the corn in the fields, and on big farms where the wheat had been cut by machines, it lay, not in sheaves, but in heaps. And I remember how those luckless heaps of wheat turned blacker every day, and the grain was sprouting in them. It was hard to work. The pouring rain spoiled everything we managed to do. We were not allowed to live or to sleep in the railway buildings, and we took refuge in the damp and filthy mud huts in which the navvies had lived during the summer, and I could not sleep at night for the cold and the woodlice crawling on my face and hands. And when we worked near the bridges, the navvies used to come in the evenings in a gang, simply in order to beat the painters; it was a form of sport to them. They used to beat us to steal our brushes, and to annoy us and rouse us to fight they used to spoil our work; they would, for instance, smear over the signal boxes with green paint. To complete our troubles, Radish took to paying us very irregularly. All the painting work on the line was given out to a contractor, he gave it out to another, and this subcontractor gave it to Radish after subtracting 20% for himself. The job was not a profitable one in itself, and the rain made it worse. Time was wasted. We could not work while Radish was obliged to pay the fellows by the day. The hungry painters almost came to beating him, calling him a cheat, a bloodsucker, a Judas, while he, poor fellow, sighed, lifted up his hand to heaven in despair, and was continually going to Madame Tcheprakov for money. End of chapter 6. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 7 of My Life. The Story of a Provincial by Anton CHEKHOV. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 7. Autumn came on, rainy, dark, and muddy. The season of unemployment set in, and I used to sit at home out of work for 3 days at a stretch, or did various little jobs not in the painting line. For instance, I wheeled earth, earning about fourpence a day by it. Dr. Blagovo had gone away to Petersburg. My sister had given up coming to see me. Radish was laid up at home ill, expecting death from day to day. And my mood was autumnal too, perhaps because, having become a workman, I saw our town life only from the seamy side. It was my lot almost every day to make discoveries which reduced me almost to despair. Those of my fellow citizens about whom I had no opinion before, or who had externally appeared perfectly decent, turned out now to be base, cruel people, capable of any dirty action. We common people were deceived, cheated, and kept waiting for hours together in the cold entry or the kitchen. We were insulted and treated with the utmost rudeness. In the autumn I papered the reading room and 2 other rooms at the club. I was paid a penny 3 farthings the piece, but had to sign a receipt at the rate of 2 pence halfpenny, and when I refused to do so, a gentleman of benevolent appearance in gold-rimmed spectacles, who must have been one of the club committee, said to me, "If you say much more, you blackguard, I'll pound your face into a jelly." And when the flunkey whispered to him what I was, the son of Polozhnev the architect, he became embarrassed, turned crimson, but immediately recovered himself and said, "Devil take him!" In the shops they palmed off on us workmen putrid meat, musty flour, and tea that had been used and dried again. The police hustled us in church, the assistants and nurses in the hospital plundered us, and if we were too poor to give them a bribe, they revenged themselves by bringing us food in dirty vessels. In the post office the pettiest official considered he had a right to treat us like animals, and to shout with coarse insolence, "You wait! Where are you shoving to?" Even the house dogs were unfriendly to us, and fell upon us with peculiar viciousness. But the thing that struck me most of all in my new position was the complete lack of justice, what is defined by the peasants in the words, "They have forgotten God." Rarely did a day pass without swindling. We were swindled by the merchants who sold us oil, by the contractors and the workmen and the people who employed us. I need not say that there could never be a question of our rights, and we always had to ask for the money we earned as though it were a charity, and to stand waiting for it at the back door, cap in hand. I was papering a room at the club next to the reading room. In the evening, when I was just getting ready to go, the daughter of Dolzhikov, the engineer, walked into the room with a bundle of books under her arm. I bowed to her. "Oh, how do you do?" she said, recognizing me at once and holding out her hand. "I'm very glad to see you." She smiled and looked with curiosity and wonder at my smock, my pail of paste, the paper stretched on the floor. I was embarrassed, and she too felt awkward. "You must excuse my looking at you like this," she said. "I have been told so much about you. Especially by Dr. Blagovo, he is simply in love with you. And I have made the acquaintance of your sister, too, a sweet, dear girl, but I can never persuade her that there is nothing awful about your adopting the simple life. On the contrary, you have become the most interesting man in the town." She looked again at the pail of paste and the wallpaper, and went on. "I asked Dr. Blagovo to make me better acquainted with you, but apparently he forgot, or had not time. Anyway, we are acquainted all the same, and if you would come and see me quite simply, I should be extremely indebted to you. I so long to have a talk. I am a simple person," she added, holding out her hand to me, "and I hope that you will feel no constraint with me. My father is not here, he is in Petersburg." She went off into the reading room, rustling her skirts, while I went home, and for a long time could not get to sleep. That cheerless autumn some kind soul, evidently wishing to alleviate my existence, sent me from time to time tea and lemons, or biscuits, or roast game. Karpovna told me that they were always brought by a soldier, and from whom they came she did not know. And the soldier used to inquire whether I was well, and whether I dined every day, and whether I had warm clothing. When the frost began, I was presented in the same way in my absence with a soft knitted scarf brought by the soldier. There was a faint elusive smell of scent about it, and I guessed who my good fairy was. The scarf smelt of lilies of the valley, the favourite scent of Anyuta Blagovo. Towards winter there was more work, and it was more cheerful. Radish recovered, and we worked together in the cemetery church, where we were putting the groundwork on the ikon stand before gilding. It was a clean, quiet job, and, as our fellows used to say, profitable. One could get through a lot of work in a day, and the time passed quickly, imperceptibly. There was no swearing, no laughter, no loud talk. The place itself compelled one to quietness and decent behaviour, and disposed one to quiet, serious thoughts. Absorbed in our work, we stood or sat motionless like statues. There was a deathly silence in keeping with the cemetery, so that if a tool fell or a flame spluttered in the lamp, the noise of such sounds rang out, abrupt and resonant, and made us look round. After a long silence we would hear a buzzing like the swarming of bees. It was the requiem of a baby being chanted slowly in subdued voices in the porch. Or an artist, painting a dove with stars round it on a cupola, would begin softly whistling, and recollecting himself with a start, would at once relapse into silence. Or Radish, answering his thoughts, would say with a sigh, "Anything is possible, anything is possible." Or a slow disconsolate bell would begin ringing over our heads, and the painters would observe that it must be for the funeral of some wealthy person. My days I spent in this stillness in the twilight of the church, and in the long evenings I played billiards, or went to the theatre in the gallery wearing the new trousers I had bought out of my own earnings. Concerts and performances had already begun at the Azhogins'. Radish used to paint the scenes alone now. He used to tell me the plot of the plays and describe the tableaux vivants which he witnessed. I listened to him with envy. I felt greatly drawn to the rehearsals, but I could not bring myself to go to the Azhogins'. A week before Christmas Dr. Blagovo arrived, and again we argued and played billiards in the evenings. When he played he used to take off his coat and unbutton his shirt over his chest, and for some reason tried altogether to assume the air of a desperate rake. He did not drink much, but made a great uproar about it, and had a special faculty for getting through 20 roubles in an evening at such a poor cheap tavern as the Volga. My sister began coming to see me again. They both expressed surprise every time on seeing each other, but from her joyful, guilty face it was evident that these meetings were not accidental. One evening, when we were playing billiards, the doctor said to me, "I say, why don't you go and see Miss Dolzhikov? You don't know Marya Viktorovna. She is a clever creature, a charmer, a simple, good-natured soul." I described how her father had received me in the spring. "Nonsense," laughed the doctor. "The engineer's one thing and she's another. Really, my dear fellow, you mustn't be nasty to her. Go and see her sometimes. For instance, let's go and see her tomorrow evening. What do you say?" He persuaded me. The next evening I put on my new serge trousers, and in some agitation I set off to Miss Dolzhikov's. The footman did not seem so haughty and terrible, nor the furniture so gorgeous, as on that morning when I had come to ask a favour. Marya Viktorovna was expecting me, and she received me like an old acquaintance, shaking hands with me in a friendly way. She was wearing a grey cloth dress with full sleeves, and had her hair done in the style which we used to call dog's ears, when it came into fashion in the town a year before. The hair was combed down over the ears, and this made Marya Viktorovna's face look broader, and she seemed to me this time very much like her father, whose face was broad and red, with something in its expression like a sledge-driver. She was handsome and elegant, but not youthful-looking. She looked 30, though in reality she was not more than 25. "Dear doctor, how grateful I am to you," she said, making me sit down. "If it hadn't been for him, you wouldn't have come to see me. I am bored to death. My father has gone away and left me alone, and I don't know what to do with myself in this town." Then she began asking me where I was working now, how much I earned, where I lived. "Do you spend on yourself nothing but what you earn?" she asked. "No." "Happy man!" she sighed. "All the evil in life, it seems to me, comes from idleness, boredom, and spiritual emptiness, and all this is inevitable when one is accustomed to living at other people's expense. Don't think I am showing off. I tell you truthfully. It is not interesting or pleasant to be rich. Make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness is said, because there is not and cannot be a mammon that's righteous. She looked round at the furniture with a grave, cold expression, as though she wanted to count it over, and went on: "Comfort and luxury have a magical power. Little by little they draw into their clutches even strong-willed people. At one time father and I lived simply, not in a rich style, but now you see how. It is something monstrous," she said, shrugging her shoulders. "We spend up to 20,000 a year in the provinces." "One comes to look at comfort and luxury as the invariable privilege of capital and education," I said. "And it seems to me that the comforts of life may be combined with any sort of labour, even the hardest and dirtiest. Your father is rich, and yet he says himself that it has been his lot to be a mechanic and an oiler." She smiled and shook her head doubtfully. "My father sometimes eats bread dipped in kvass," she said. "It's a fancy, a whim." At that moment there was a ring, and she got up. "The rich and well educated ought to work like every one else," she said, "and if there is comfort it ought to be equal for all. There ought not to be any privileges. But that's enough philosophizing. Tell me something amusing. Tell me about the painters. What are they like? Funny?" The doctor came in. I began telling them about the painters, but, being unaccustomed to talking, I was constrained, and described them like an ethnologist, gravely and tediously. The doctor, too, told us some anecdotes of working men. He staggered about, shed tears, dropped on his knees, and even, mimicking a drunkard, lay on the floor. It was as good as a play, and Maria Viktorovna laughed till she cried as she looked at him. Then he played on the piano and sang in his thin, pleasant tenor, while Maria Viktorovna stood by and picked out what he was to sing and corrected him when he made a mistake. "I've heard that you sing too?" I inquired. "Sing too!" cried the doctor in horror. "She sings exquisitely, a perfect artist, and you talk of her singing too! What an idea!" "I did study in earnest at one time," she said, answering my question, "but now I have given it up." Sitting on a low stool, she told us of her life in Petersburg, and mimicked some celebrated singers, imitating their voice and manner of singing. She made a sketch of the doctor in her album, then of me. She did not draw well, but both the portraits were like us. She laughed and was full of mischief and charming grimaces, and this suited her better than talking about the mammon of unrighteousness, and it seemed to me that she had been talking just before about wealth and luxury, not in earnest, but in imitation of some one. She was a superb comic actress. I mentally compared her with our young ladies, and even the handsome, dignified Anyuta Blagovo could not stand comparison with her. The difference was immense, like the difference between a beautiful cultivated rose and a wild briar. We had supper together, the three of us. The doctor and Maria Viktorovna drank red wine, champagne and coffee with brandy in it. They clinked glasses and drank to friendship, to enlightenment, to progress, to liberty, and they did not get drunk, but only flushed, and were continually, for no reason, laughing till they cried. So as not to be tiresome, I drank claret too. "Talented, richly endowed natures," said Miss Dolzhikov, "know how to live, and go their own way. Mediocre people like myself, for instance, know nothing and can do nothing of themselves. There is nothing left for them but to discern some deep social movement and to float where they are carried by it." "How can one discern what doesn't exist?" asked the doctor. "We think so because we don't see it." "Is that so? The social movements are the invention of the new literature. There are none among us." An argument began. "There are no deep social movements among us, and never have been," the doctor declared loudly. "There is no end to what the new literature has invented. It has invented intellectual workers in the country, and you may search through all our villages and find at the most some lout in a reefer jacket or a black frock coat who will make four mistakes in spelling a word of three letters. Cultured life has not yet begun among us. There's the same savagery, the same uniform boorishness, the same triviality as 500 years ago. Movements, currents there have been, but it has all been petty, paltry, bent upon vulgar and mercenary interests, and one cannot see anything important in them. If you think you have discerned a deep social movement, and in following it you devote yourself to tasks in the modern taste, such as the emancipation of insects from slavery, or abstinence from beef rissoles, I congratulate you, madam. We must study and study and study, and we must wait a bit with our deep social movements. We are not mature enough for them yet, and to tell the truth, we don't know anything about them." "You don't know anything about them, but I do," said Maria Viktorovna. "Goodness, how tiresome you are to-day!" "Our duty is to study and to study, to try to accumulate as much knowledge as possible, for genuine social movements arise where there is knowledge. And the happiness of mankind in the future lies only in knowledge. I drink to science." "There is no doubt about one thing: one must organize one's life somehow differently," said Maria Viktorovna after a moment's silence and thought. "Life, such as it has been hitherto, is not worth having. Don't let us talk about it." As we came away from her, the cathedral clock struck 2. "Did you like her?" asked the doctor. "She's nice, isn't she?" On Christmas Day we dined with Maria Viktorovna, and all through the holidays we went to see her almost every day. There was never any one there but ourselves, and she was right when she said that she had no friends in the town but the doctor and me. We spent our time for the most part in conversation. Sometimes the doctor brought some book or magazine and read aloud to us. In reality he was the first well-educated man I had met in my life. I cannot judge whether he knew a great deal, but he always displayed his knowledge as though he wanted other people to share it. When he talked about anything relating to medicine, he was not like any one of the doctors in our town, but made a fresh, peculiar impression upon me, and I fancied that if he liked he might have become a real man of science. And he was perhaps the only person who had a real influence upon me at that time. Seeing him and reading the books he gave me, I began little by little to feel a thirst for the knowledge which would have given significance to my cheerless labour. It seemed strange to me, for instance, that I had not known till then that the whole world was made up of 60 elements, that I had not known what oil was, what paints were, and that I could have got on without knowing these things. My acquaintance with the doctor elevated me morally too. I was continually arguing with him, and though I usually remained of my own opinion, yet, thanks to him, I began to perceive that everything was not clear to me, and I began trying to work out as far as I could definite convictions in myself, that the dictates of conscience might be definite, and that there might be nothing vague in my mind. Yet, though he was the most cultivated and best man in the town, he was nevertheless far from perfection. In his manners, in his habit of turning every conversation into an argument, in his pleasant tenor, even in his friendliness, there was something coarse, like a divinity student; and when he took off his coat and sat in his silk shirt, or flung a tip to a waiter in the restaurant, I always fancied that culture might be all very well, but the Tatar was fermenting in him still. At Epiphany he went back to Petersburg. He went off in the morning, and after dinner my sister came in. Without taking off her fur coat and her cap, she sat down in silence, very pale, and kept her eyes fixed on the same spot. She was chilled by the frost, and one could see that she was upset by it. "You must have caught cold," I said. Her eyes filled with tears. She got up and went out to Karpovna without saying a word to me, as though I had hurt her feelings. And a little later I heard her saying in a tone of bitter reproach: "Nurse, what have I been living for till now? What? Tell me, haven't I wasted my youth? All the best years of my life to know nothing but keeping accounts, pouring out tea, counting the halfpence, entertaining visitors, and thinking there was nothing better in the world. Nurse, do understand. I have the cravings of a human being, and I want to live, and they have turned me into something like a housekeeper. It's horrible, horrible!" She flung her keys towards the door, and they fell with a jingle into my room. They were the keys of the sideboard, of the kitchen cupboard, of the cellar, and of the tea caddy, the keys which my mother used to carry. "Oh, merciful heavens!" cried the old woman in horror. "Holy saints above!" Before going home my sister came into my room to pick up the keys and said: "You must forgive me. Something queer has happened to me lately." End of chapter 7. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 8 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 8. On returning home late one evening from Maria Viktorovna's, I found waiting in my room a young police inspector in a new uniform. He was sitting at my table, looking through my books. "At last," he said, getting up and stretching himself. "This is the third time I have been to you. The governor commands you to present yourself before him at 9 o'clock in the morning, without fail." He took from me a signed statement that I would act upon His Excellency's command, and went away. This late visit of the police inspector, an unexpected invitation to the governor's, had an overwhelmingly oppressive effect upon me. From my earliest childhood I have felt terror-stricken in the presence of gendarmes, policemen, and law court officials, and now I was tormented by uneasiness, as though I were really guilty in some way, and I could not get to sleep. My nurse and Prokofy were also upset and could not sleep. My nurse had earache too; she moaned, and several times began crying with pain. Hearing that I was awake, Prokofy came into my room with a lamp and sat down at the table. "You ought to have a drink of pepper cordial," he said, after a moment's thought. "If one does have a drink in this vale of tears, it does no harm. And if Mamma were to pour a little pepper cordial in her ear, it would do her a lot of good." Between 2 and 3 he was going to the slaughter-house for the meat. I knew I should not sleep till morning now, and to get through the time till 9 o'clock I went with him. We walked with a lantern, while his boy Nikolka, aged 13, with blue patches on his cheeks from frostbites, a regular young brigand to judge by his expression, drove after us in the sledge, urging on the horse in a husky voice. "I suppose they will punish you at the governor's," Prokofy said to me on the way. "There are rules of the trade for governors, and rules for the higher clergy, and rules for the officers, and rules for the doctors, and every class has its rules. But you haven't kept to your rules, and you can't be allowed." The slaughter-house was behind the cemetery; until then I had only seen it in the distance. It consisted of 3 gloomy barns, surrounded by a grey fence, and when the wind blew from that quarter on hot days in summer, it brought a stifling stench from them. Now, going into the yard in the dark, I did not see the barns. I kept coming across horses and sledges, some empty, some loaded up with meat. Men were walking about with lanterns, swearing in a disgusting way. Prokofy and Nikolka swore just as revoltingly, and the air was in a continual uproar with swearing, coughing, and the neighing of horses. There was the smell of dead bodies and of dung. It was thawing, the snow was changing into mud, and in the darkness it seemed to me that I was walking through pools of blood. Having piled up the sledges full of meat, we set off to the butcher's shop in the market. It began to get light. Cooks with baskets and elderly ladies in mantles came along one after another. Prokofy, with a chopper in his hand and a white apron spattered with blood, swore fearful oaths, crossed himself at the church, shouted aloud for the whole market to hear that he was giving away the meat at cost price and even at a loss to himself. He gave short weight and short change, the cooks saw that, but, deafened by his shouts, did not protest, and only called him a hangman. Brandishing and bringing down his terrible chopper, he threw himself into picturesque attitudes, and each time uttered the sound "Gek" with a ferocious expression, and I was afraid he really would chop off somebody's head or hand. I spent all the morning in the butcher's shop, and when at last I went to the governor's, my overcoat smelt of meat and blood. My state of mind was as though I were being sent, spear in hand, to meet a bear. I remember the tall staircase with a striped carpet on it, and the young official with shiny buttons, who mutely motioned me to the door with both hands, and ran to announce me. I went into a hall, luxuriously but frigidly and tastelessly furnished, and the high, narrow mirrors in the spaces between the walls, and the bright yellow window curtains struck the eye particularly unpleasantly. One could see that the governors were changed, but the furniture remained the same. Again the young official motioned me with both hands to the door, and I went up to a big green table at which a military general, with the Order of Vladimir on his breast, was standing. "Mr. Poloznev, I have asked you to come," he began, holding a letter in his hand and opening his mouth like a round O. "I have asked you to come here to inform you of this. Your highly respected father has appealed by letter and by word of mouth to the Marshal of the Nobility, begging him to summon you, and to lay before you the inconsistency of your behaviour with the rank of the nobility to which you have the honour to belong. His Excellency Alexander Pavlovitch, justly supposing that your conduct might serve as a bad example, and considering that mere persuasion on his part would not be sufficient, but that official intervention in earnest was essential, presents me here in this letter with his views in regard to you, which I share." He said this, quietly, respectfully, standing erect, as though I were his superior officer, and looking at me with no trace of severity. His face looked worn and wizened and was all wrinkles. There were bags under his eyes. His hair was dyed, and it was impossible to tell from his appearance how old he was, 40 or 60. "I trust," he went on, "that you appreciate the delicacy of our honoured Alexander Pavlovitch, who has addressed himself to me not officially, but privately. I, too, have asked you to come here unofficially, and I am speaking to you not as a governor, but from a sincere regard for your father. And so I beg you either to alter your line of conduct and return to duties in keeping with your rank, or to avoid setting a bad example, remove to another district where you are not known, and where you can follow any occupation you please. In the other case I shall be forced to take extreme measures." He stood for half a minute in silence, looking at me with his mouth open. "Are you a vegetarian?" he asked. "No, your Excellency, I eat meat." He sat down and drew some papers towards him. I bowed and went out. It was not worth while now to go to work before dinner. I went home to sleep, but could not sleep from an unpleasant sickly feeling induced by the slaughter-house and my conversation with the governor. And when the evening came, I went, gloomy and out of sorts, to Maria Viktorovna. I told her how I had been at the governor's, while she stared at me in perplexity as though she did not believe it, then suddenly began laughing gaily, loudly, irrepressibly, as only good-natured, laughter-loving people can. "If only one could tell that in Petersburg!" she brought out, almost falling over with laughter, and propping herself against the table. "If one could tell that in Petersburg!" End of chapter 8. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 9 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 9. Now we used to see each other often, sometimes twice a day. She used to come to the cemetery almost every day after dinner and read the epitaphs on the crosses and tombstones while she waited for me. Sometimes she would come into the church, and standing by me would look on while I worked. The stillness, the naive work of the painters and gilders, Radish's sage reflections, and the fact that I did not differ externally from the other workmen, and worked just as they did in my waistcoat with no socks on, and that I was addressed familiarly by them, all this was new to her and touched her. One day a workman, who was painting a dove on the ceiling, called out to me in her presence, "Misail, hand me up the white paint." I took him the white paint, and afterwards, when I let myself down by the frail scaffolding, she looked at me, touched to tears and smiling. "What a dear you are!" she said. I remembered from my childhood how a green parrot belonging to one of the rich men of the town had escaped from its cage, and how for quite a month afterwards the beautiful bird had haunted the town, flying from garden to garden, homeless and solitary. Maria Viktorovna reminded me of that bird. "There is positively nowhere for me to go now but the cemetery," she said to me with a laugh. "The town has become disgustingly dull. At the Azhogins' they are still reciting, singing, lisping. I have grown to detest them of late. Your sister is an unsociable creature. Mademoiselle Blagovo hates me for some reason. I don't care for the theatre. Tell me, where am I to go?" When I went to see her, I smelt of paint and turpentine, and my hands were stained. And she liked that. She wanted me to come to her in my ordinary working clothes, but in her drawing room those clothes made me feel awkward. I felt embarrassed, as though I were in uniform, so I always put on my new serge trousers when I went to her, and she did not like that. "You must own you are not quite at home in your new character," she said to me one day. "Your workman's dress does not feel natural to you; you are awkward in it. Tell me, isn't that because you haven't a firm conviction, and are not satisfied? The very kind of work you have chosen, your painting, surely it does not satisfy you, does it?" she asked, laughing. "I know paint makes things look nicer and last longer, but those things belong to rich people who live in towns, and after all they are luxuries. Besides, you have often said yourself that everybody ought to get his bread by the work of his own hands, yet you get money and not bread. Why shouldn't you keep to the literal sense of your words? You ought to be getting bread, that is, you ought to be ploughing, sowing, reaping, threshing, or doing something which has a direct connection with agriculture, for instance, looking after cows, digging, building huts of logs." She opened a pretty cupboard that stood near her writing table, and said, "I am saying all this to you because I want to let you into my secret. Voilà! This is my agricultural library. Here I have fields, kitchen garden and orchard, and cattle yard and beehives. I read them greedily, and have already learnt all the theory to the tiniest detail. My dream, my darling wish, is to go to our Dubetchnya as soon as March is here. It's marvellous there, exquisite, isn't it? The first year I shall have a look round and get into things, and the year after I shall begin to work properly myself, putting my back into it, as they say. My father has promised to give me Dubetchnya, and I shall do exactly what I like with it." Flushed, excited to tears, and laughing, she dreamed aloud how she would live at Dubetchnya, and what an interesting life it would be. I envied her. March was near, the days were growing longer and longer, and on bright sunny days water dripped from the roofs at midday, and there was a fragrance of spring. I, too, longed for the country. And when she said that she should move to Dubetchnya, I realized vividly that I should remain in the town alone, and I felt that I envied her with her cupboard of books and her agriculture. I knew nothing of work on the land, and did not like it, and I should have liked to have told her that work on the land was slavish toil, but I remembered that something similar had been said more than once by my father, and I held my tongue. Lent began. Victor Ivanitch, whose existence I had begun to forget, arrived from Petersburg. He arrived unexpectedly, without even a telegram to say he was coming. When I went in, as usual in the evening, he was walking about the drawing room, telling some story with his face freshly washed and shaven, looking 10 years younger. His daughter was kneeling on the floor, taking out of his trunks boxes, bottles, and books, and handing them to Pavel the footman. I involuntarily drew back a step when I saw the engineer, but he held out both hands to me and said, smiling, showing his strong white teeth that looked like a sledge driver's, "Here he is, here he is! Very glad to see you, Mr. House Painter. Masha has told me all about it. She has been singing your praises. I quite understand and approve," he went on, taking my arm. "To be a good workman is ever so much more honest and more sensible than wasting government paper and wearing a cockade on your head. I myself worked in Belgium with these very hands, and then spent 2 years as a mechanic." He was wearing a short reefer jacket and indoor slippers. He walked like a man with the gout, rolling slightly from side to side and rubbing his hands. Humming something, he softly purred and hugged himself with satisfaction at being at home again at last, and able to have his beloved shower bath. "There is no disputing," he said to me at supper. "There is no disputing. You are all nice and charming people, but for some reason, as soon as you take to manual labour, or go in for saving the peasants, in the long run it all comes to no more than being a dissenter. Aren't you a dissenter? Here you don't take vodka. What's the meaning of that if it is not being a dissenter?" To satisfy him I drank some vodka, and I drank some wine too. We tasted the cheese, the sausage, the pâtés, the pickles, and the savouries of all sorts that the engineer had brought with him, and the wine that had come in his absence from abroad. The wine was first rate. For some reason the engineer got wine and cigars from abroad without paying duty. The caviare and the dried sturgeon some one sent him for nothing. He did not pay rent for his flat, as the owner of the house provided the kerosene for the line, and altogether he and his daughter produced on me the impression that all the best in the world was at their service, and provided for them for nothing. I went on going to see them, but not with the same eagerness. The engineer made me feel constrained, and in his presence I did not feel free. I could not face his clear, guileless eyes; his reflections wearied and sickened me. I was sickened, too, by the memory that so lately I had been in the employment of this red-faced, well-fed man, and that he had been brutally rude to me. It is true that he put his arm round my waist, slapped me on the shoulder in a friendly way, approved my manner of life; but I felt that, as before, he despised my insignificance, and only put up with me to please his daughter, and I couldn't now laugh and talk as I liked, and I behaved unsociably and kept expecting that in another minute he would address me as Panteley as he did his footman Pavel. How my pride as a provincial and a working man was revolted! I, a proletarian, a house painter, went every day to rich people who were alien to me, and whom the whole town regarded as though they were foreigners, and every day I drank costly wines with them and ate unusual dainties. My conscience refused to be reconciled to it. On my way to the house I sullenly avoided meeting people, and looked at them from under my brows as though I really were a dissenter, and when I was going home from the engineer's I was ashamed of my well-fed condition. Above all, I was afraid of being carried away. Whether I was walking along the street, or working, or talking to the other fellows, I was all the time thinking of one thing only of going in the evening to see Marya Viktorovna, and was picturing her voice, her laugh, her movements. When I was getting ready to go to her, I always spent a long time before my nurse's warped looking-glass as I fastened my tie. My serge trousers were detestable in my eyes, and I suffered torments, and at the same time despised myself for being so trivial. When she called to me out of the other room that she was not dressed and asked me to wait, I listened to her dressing. It agitated me. I felt as though the ground were giving way under my feet. And when I saw a woman's figure in the street, even at a distance, I invariably compared it. It seemed to me that all our girls and women were vulgar, that they were absurdly dressed, and did not know how to hold themselves. And these comparisons aroused a feeling of pride in me. Marya Viktorovna was the best of them all, and I dreamed of her and myself at night. One evening at supper with the engineer we ate a whole lobster. As I was going home afterwards I remembered that the engineer twice called me "my dear fellow" at supper, and I reflected that they treated me very kindly in that house, as they might an unfortunate big dog who had been kicked out by its owners; that they were amusing themselves with me, and that when they were tired of me they would turn me out like a dog. I felt ashamed and wounded to the point of tears as though I had been insulted, and looking up at the sky I took a vow to put an end to all this. The next day I did not go to the Dolzhikovs'. Late in the evening, when it was quite dark and raining, I walked along Great Dvoryansky Street, looking up at the windows. Every one was asleep at the Azhogins', and the only light was in one of the furthest windows. It was Madame Azhogin in her own room, sewing by the light of 3 candles, imagining that she was combating superstition. Our house was in darkness, but at the Dolzhikovs', on the contrary, the windows were lighted up, but one could distinguish nothing through the flowers and the curtains. I kept walking up and down the street. The cold March rain drenched me through. I heard my father come home from the club. He stood knocking at the gate. A minute later a light appeared at the window, and I saw my sister, who was hastening down with a lamp, while with the other hand she was twisting her thick hair together as she went. Then my father walked about the drawing room, talking and rubbing his hands, while my sister sat in a low chair, thinking and not listening to what he said. But then they went away. The light went out. I glanced round at the engineer's, and there, too, all was darkness now. In the dark and the rain I felt hopelessly alone, abandoned to the whims of destiny. I felt that all my doings, my desires, and everything I had thought and said till then were trivial in comparison with my loneliness, in comparison with my present suffering, and the suffering that lay before me in the future. Alas, the thoughts and doings of living creatures are not nearly so significant as their sufferings. And without clearly realizing what I was doing, I pulled at the bell of the Dolzhikovs' gate, broke it, and ran along the street like some naughty boy, with a feeling of terror in my heart, expecting every moment that they would come out and recognize me. When I stopped at the end of the street to take breath, I could hear nothing but the sound of the rain and somewhere in the distance a watchman striking on a sheet of iron. For a whole week I did not go to the Dolzhikovs'. My serge trousers were sold. There was nothing doing in the painting trade. I knew the pangs of hunger again, and earned from twopence to fourpence a day, where I could, by heavy and unpleasant work. Struggling up to my knees in the cold mud, straining my chest, I tried to stifle my memories, and, as it were, to punish myself for the cheeses and preserves with which I had been regaled at the engineer's. But all the same, as soon as I lay in bed, wet and hungry, my sinful imagination immediately began to paint exquisite, seductive pictures, and with amazement I acknowledged to myself that I was in love, passionately in love, and I fell into a sound, heavy sleep, feeling that hard labour only made my body stronger and younger. One evening snow began falling most inappropriately, and the wind blew from the north as though winter had come back again. When I returned from work that evening, I found Maria Viktorovna in my room. She was sitting in her fur coat and had both hands in her muff. "Why don't you come to see me?" she asked, raising her clear, clever eyes, and I was utterly confused with delight and stood stiffly upright before her, as I used to stand facing my father when he was going to beat me. She looked into my face, and I could see from her eyes that she understood why I was confused. "Why don't you come to see me?" she repeated. "If you don't want to come, you see, I have come to you." She got up and came close to me. "Don't desert me," she said, and her eyes filled with tears. "I am alone, utterly alone." She began crying, and hiding her face in her muff, articulated: "Alone. My life is hard, very hard, and in all the world I have no one but you. Don't desert me." Looking for a handkerchief to wipe her tears, she smiled. We were silent for some time, then I put my arms round her and kissed her, scratching my cheek till it bled with her hatpin as I did it. And we began talking to each other as though we had been on the closest terms for ages and ages. End of chapter 9. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 10 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 10. 2 days later she sent me to Dubetchnya, and I was unutterably delighted to go. As I walked towards the station and afterwards, as I was sitting in the train, I kept laughing from no apparent cause, and people looked at me as though I were drunk. Snow was falling, and there were still frosts in the mornings, but the roads were already dark-coloured, and rooks hovered over them, cawing. At first I had intended to fit up an abode for us two, Masha and me, in the lodge at the side opposite Madame Tcheprakov's lodge. But it appeared that the doves and the ducks had been living there for a long time, and it was impossible to clean it without destroying a great number of nests. There was nothing for it but to live in the comfortless rooms of the big house with the sun-blinds. The peasants called the house the palace. There were more than 20 rooms in it, and the only furniture was a piano and a child's arm-chair lying in the attic. And if Masha had brought all her furniture from the town, we should even then have been unable to get rid of the impression of immense emptiness and cold. I picked out 3 small rooms with windows looking into the garden, and worked from early morning till night, setting them to rights, putting in new panes, papering the walls, filling up the holes and chinks in the floors. It was easy, pleasant work. I was continually running to the river to see whether the ice were not going. I kept fancying that starlings were flying. And at night, thinking of Masha, I listened with an unutterably sweet feeling, with clutching delight, to the noise of the rats and the wind droning and knocking above the ceiling. It seemed as though some old house spirit were coughing in the attic. The snow was deep. A great deal had fallen even at the end of March, but it melted quickly, as though by magic, and the spring floods passed in a tumultuous rush, so that by the beginning of April the starlings were already noisy, and yellow butterflies were flying in the garden. It was exquisite weather. Every day towards evening I used to walk to the town to meet Masha, and what a delight it was to walk with bare feet along the gradually drying, still soft road. Half way I used to sit down and look towards the town, not venturing to go near it. The sight of it troubled me. I kept wondering how the people I knew would behave to me when they heard of my love. What would my father say? What troubled me particularly was the thought that my life was more complicated, and that I had completely lost all power to set it right, and that, like a balloon, it was bearing me away, God knows whither. I no longer considered the problem how to earn my daily bread, how to live, but thought about I really don't know what. Masha used to come in a carriage. I used to get in with her, and we drove to Dubetchnya, feeling light-hearted and free. Or after waiting till the sun had set, I would go back dissatisfied and dreary, wondering why Masha had not come. At the gate or in the garden I would be met by a sweet, unexpected apparition. It was she. It would turn out that she had come by rail and had walked from the station. What a festival it was! In a simple woollen dress with a kerchief on her head, with a modest sunshade, but laced in, slender, in expensive foreign boots, it was a talented actress playing the part of a little work girl. We looked round our domain and decided which should be her room and which mine, where we would have our avenue, our kitchen garden, our beehives. We already had hens, ducks, and geese, which we loved because they were ours. We had, all ready for sowing, oats, clover, timothy grass, buckwheat, and vegetable seeds, and we always looked at all these stores and discussed at length the crop we might get. And everything Masha said to me seemed extraordinarily clever and fine. This was the happiest time of my life. Soon after St. Thomas's week we were married at our parish church in the valley of Kurilovka, 2 miles from Dubetchnya. Masha wanted everything to be done quietly. At her wish our best men were peasant lads, the sacristan sang alone, and we came back from the church in a small jolting chaise which she drove herself. Our only guest from the town was my sister Cleopatra, to whom Masha sent a note 3 days before the wedding. My sister came in a white dress and wore gloves. During the wedding she cried quietly from joy and tenderness. Her expression was motherly and infinitely kind. She was intoxicated with our happiness, and smiled as though she were absorbing a sweet delirium, and looking at her during our wedding, I realized that for her there was nothing in the world higher than love, earthly love, and that she was dreaming of it secretly, timidly, but continually and passionately. She embraced and kissed Masha, and, not knowing how to express her rapture, said to her of me, "He is good, he is very good." Before she went away she changed into her ordinary dress and drew me into the garden to talk to me alone. "Father is very much hurt," she said, "that you have written nothing to him. You ought to have asked for his blessing. But in reality he is very much pleased. He says that this marriage will raise you in the eyes of all society, and that under the influence of Maria Viktorovna you will begin to take a more serious view of life. We talk of nothing but you in the evenings now, and yesterday he actually used the expression 'our missile.' That pleased me. It seems as though he had some plan in his mind, and I fancy he wants to set you an example of magnanimity and be the first to speak of reconciliation. It is very possible he may come here to see you in a day or two." She hurriedly made the sign of the cross over me several times and said, "Well, God be with you. Be happy. Anyuta Blagovo is a very clever girl. She says about your marriage that God is sending you a fresh ordeal. To be sure, married life does not bring only joy, but suffering too. That's bound to be so." Masha and I walked a couple of miles to see her on her way. We walked back slowly and in silence, as though we were resting. Masha held my hand, my heart felt light, and I had no inclination to talk about love. We had become closer and more akin now that we were married, and we felt that nothing now could separate us. "Your sister is a nice creature," said Masha, "but it seems as though she had been tormented for years. Your father must be a terrible man." I began telling her how my sister and I had been brought up, and what a senseless torture our childhood had really been. When she heard how my father had so lately beaten me, she shuddered and drew closer to me. "Don't tell me any more," she said. "It's horrible." Now she never left me. We lived together in the 3 rooms in the big house, and in the evenings we bolted the door which led to the empty part of the house, as though some one were living there whom we did not know and were afraid of. I got up early at dawn, and immediately set to work of some sort. I mended the carts, made paths in the garden, dug the flower beds, painted the roof of the house. When the time came to sow the oats, I tried to plough the ground over again, to harrow and to sow, and I did it all conscientiously, keeping up with our labourer. I was worn out; the rain and the cold wind made my face and feet burn for hours afterwards. I dreamed of ploughed land at night. But field labour did not attract me. I did not understand farming, and I did not care for it. It was perhaps because my forefathers had not been tillers of the soil, and the very blood that flowed in my veins was purely of the city. I loved nature tenderly. I loved the fields and meadows and kitchen gardens, but the peasant who turned up the soil with his plough and urged on his pitiful horse, wet and tattered with his craning neck, was to me the expression of coarse, savage, ugly force, and every time I looked at his uncouth movements, I involuntarily began thinking of the legendary life of the remote past before men knew the use of fire. The fierce bull that ran with the peasant's herd, and the horses when they dashed about the village, stamping their hoofs, moved me to fear, and everything rather big, strong, and angry, whether it was the ram with its horns, the gander, or the yard dog, seemed to me the expression of the same coarse, savage force. This mood was particularly strong in me in bad weather, when heavy clouds were hanging over the black ploughed land. Above all, when I was ploughing or sowing, and two or three people stood looking how I was doing it, I had not the feeling that this work was inevitable and obligatory, and it seemed to me that I was amusing myself. I preferred doing something in the yard, and there was nothing I liked so much as painting the roof. I used to walk through the garden and the meadow to our mill. It was let to a peasant of Kurilovka called Stepan, a handsome, dark fellow with a thick black beard, who looked very strong. He did not like the miller's work, and looked upon it as dreary and unprofitable, and only lived at the mill in order not to live at home. He was a leather worker, and was always surrounded by a pleasant smell of tar and leather. He was not fond of talking, he was listless and sluggish, and was always sitting in the doorway or on the river bank humming "oolulu." His wife and mother-in-law, both white-faced, languid, and meek, used sometimes to come from Kirillovka to see him. They made low bows to him and addressed him formally, Stepan Petrovitch, while he went on sitting on the river bank softly humming "oolulu," without responding by word or movement to their bows. 1 hour and then a second would pass in silence. His mother-in-law and wife, after whispering together, would get up and gaze at him for some time, expecting him to look round. Then they would make a low bow, and in sugary, chanting voices say, "Good-bye, Stepan Petrovitch," and they would go away. After that Stepan, picking up the parcel they had left, containing cracknels or a shirt, would heave a sigh and say, winking in their direction, "The female sex." The mill with two sets of millstones worked day and night. I used to help Stepan. I liked the work, and when he went off I was glad to stay and take his place. End of chapter 10. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 11 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 11. After bright, warm weather came a spell of wet. All May it rained and was cold. The sound of the mill wheels and of the rain disposed one to indolence and slumber. The floor trembled, there was a smell of flour, and that, too, induced drowsiness. My wife, in a short fur-lined jacket and in men's high galosh boots, would make her appearance twice a day, and she always said the same thing: "And this is called summer? Worse than it was in October!" We used to have tea and make the porridge together, or we would sit for hours at a stretch without speaking, waiting for the rain to stop. Once, when Stepan had gone off to the fair, Masha stayed all night at the mill. When we got up we could not tell what time it was, as the rain clouds covered the whole sky. But sleepy cocks were crowing at Dubetchnya, and landrails were calling in the meadows. It was still very, very early. My wife and I went down to the mill pond and drew out the net, which Stepan had thrown in overnight in our presence. A big pike was struggling in it, and a crayfish was twisting about, clawing upwards with its pincers. "Let them go," said Masha. "Let them be happy too." Because we got up so early and afterwards did nothing, that day seemed very long, the longest day in my life. Towards evening Stepan came back and I went home. "Your father came to day," said Masha. "Where is he?" I asked. "He has gone away. I would not see him." Seeing that I remained standing and silent, that I was sorry for my father, she said, "One must be consistent. I would not see him, and sent word to him not to trouble to come and see us again." A minute later I was out at the gate and walking to the town to explain things to my father. It was muddy, slippery, cold. For the first time since my marriage I felt suddenly sad, and in my brain, exhausted by that long grey day, there was stirring the thought that perhaps I was not living as I ought. I was worn out. Little by little I was overcome by despondency and indolence. I did not want to move or think. And after going on a little, I gave it up with a wave of my hand and turned back. The engineer in a leather overcoat with a hood was standing in the middle of the yard. "Where's the furniture? There used to be lovely furniture in the Empire style. There used to be pictures, there used to be vases, while now you could play ball in it. I bought the place with the furniture, the devil take her!" Moisey, a thin, pock-marked fellow of 25, with insolent little eyes, who was in the service of the general's widow, stood near him crumpling up his cap in his hands. One of his cheeks was bigger than the other, as though he had lain too long on it. "Your honour was graciously pleased to buy the place without the furniture," he brought out irresolutely. "I remember." "Hold your tongue!" shouted the engineer. He turned crimson and shook with anger, and the echo in the garden loudly repeated his shout. End of chapter 11. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 12 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton CHEKHOV. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 12. When I was doing anything in the garden or the yard, Moisey would stand beside me, and, folding his arms behind his back, he would stand lazily and impudently staring at me with his little eyes. And this irritated me to such a degree that I threw up my work and went away. From Stepan we learned that Moisey was Madame Tcheprakov's lover. I noticed that when people came to her to borrow money, they addressed themselves first to Moisey, and once I saw a peasant black from head to foot he must have been a coal heaver bow down at Moisey's feet. Sometimes, after a little whispering, he gave out money himself without consulting his mistress, from which I concluded that he did a little business on his own account. He used to shoot in our garden under our windows, carried off victuals from our cellar, borrowed our horses without asking permission, and we were indignant and began to feel as though Dubetchnya were not ours, and Masha would say, turning pale, "Can we really have to go on living with these reptiles another 18 months?" Madame Tcheprakov's son, Ivan, was serving as a guard on our railway line. He had grown much thinner and feebler during the winter, so that a single glass was enough to make him drunk, and he shivered out of the sunshine. He wore the guard's uniform with aversion and was ashamed of it, but considered his post a good one, as he could steal the candles and sell them. My new position excited in him a mixed feeling of wonder, envy, and a vague hope that something of the same sort might happen to him. He used to watch Masha with ecstatic eyes, ask me what I had for dinner now, and his lean and ugly face wore a sad and Swedish expression, and he moved his fingers as though he were feeling my happiness with them. "Listen, Better than Nothing," he said fussily, relighting his cigarette at every instant. There was always a litter where he stood, for he wasted dozens of matches lighting one cigarette. "Listen, my life now is the nastiest possible. The worst of it is any subaltern can shout, 'Hi there, guard!' I have overheard all sorts of things in the train, my boy, and do you know I have learned that life's a beastly thing. My mother has been the ruin of me. A doctor in the train told me that if parents are immoral, their children are drunkards or criminals. Think of that!" Once he came into the yard staggering. His eyes gazed about blankly, his breathing was laboured. He laughed and cried and babbled as though in a high fever, and the only words I could catch in his muddled talk were, "My mother! Where's my mother?" which he uttered with a wail like a child who has lost his mother in a crowd. I led him into our garden and laid him down under a tree, and Masha and I took turns to sit by him all that day and all night. He was very sick, and Masha looked with aversion at his pale, wet face and said, "Is it possible these reptiles will go on living another year and a half in our yard? It's awful, it's awful!" And how many mortifications the peasants caused us! How many bitter disappointments in those early days in the spring months when we so longed to be happy! My wife built a school. I drew a plan of a school for 60 boys, and the Zemstvo board approved of it, but advised us to build the school at Kurilovka, the big village which was only 2 miles from us. Moreover, the school at Kurilovka, in which children from 4 villages, our Dubetchnya being one of the number, were taught, was old and too small, and the floor was scarcely safe to walk upon. At the end of March, at Masha's wish, she was appointed guardian of the Kurilovka school, and at the beginning of April we 3 times summoned the village assembly, and tried to persuade the peasants that their school was old and overcrowded, and that it was essential to build a new one. A member of the Zemstvo board and the inspector of peasant schools came, and they too tried to persuade them. After each meeting the peasants surrounded us, begging for a bucket of vodka. We were hot in the crowd, we were soon exhausted, and returned home dissatisfied and a little ill at ease. In the end the peasants set apart a plot of ground for the school, and were obliged to bring all the building material from the town with their own horses. And the very first Sunday after the spring corn was sown, carts set off from Kurilovka and Dubetchnya to fetch bricks for the foundations. They set off as soon as it was light, and came back late in the evening. The peasants were drunk and said they were worn out. As ill luck would have it, the rain and the cold persisted all through May. The road was in an awful state; it was deep in mud. The carts usually drove into our yard when they came back from the town, and what a horrible ordeal it was! A pot-bellied horse would appear at the gate, setting its front legs wide apart. It would stumble forward before coming into the yard. A beam, 9 yards long, wet and slimy looking, crept in on a wagon. Beside it, muffled up against the rain, strode a peasant, with the skirts of his coat tucked up in his belt, not looking where he was going, but stepping through the puddles. Another cart would appear with boards, then a third with a beam, a fourth, and the space before our house was gradually crowded up with horses, beams, and planks. Men and women, with their heads muffled and their skirts tucked up, would stare angrily at our windows, make an uproar, and clamour for the mistress to come out to them. Coarse oaths were audible. Meanwhile Moisey stood at one side, and we fancied he was enjoying our discomfiture. "We are not going to cart any more," the peasants would shout. "We are worn out. Let her go and get the stuff herself." Masha, pale and flustered, expecting every minute that they would break into the house, would send them out a half pail of vodka. After that the noise would subside, and the long beams, one after another, would crawl slowly out of the yard. When I was setting off to see the building, my wife was worried and said, "The peasants are spiteful. I only hope they won't do you a mischief. Wait a minute, I'll come with you." We drove to Kurilovka together, and there the carpenters asked us for a drink. The framework of the house was ready. It was time to lay the foundation, but the masons had not come. This caused delay, and the carpenters complained. And when at last the masons did come, it appeared that there was no sand. It had been somehow overlooked that it would be needed. Taking advantage of our helpless position, the peasants demanded 30 kopecks for each cartload, though the distance from the building to the river where they got the sand was less than a quarter of a mile, and more than 500 cartloads were found to be necessary. There was no end to the misunderstandings, swearing, and importunity. My wife was indignant, and the foreman of the masons, Tit Petrov, an old man of 70, took her by the arm and said, "You look here, you look here! You only bring me the sand, I set 10 men on it at once, in 2 days it will be done. You look here!" But they brought the sand, and 2 days passed, and 4, and a week, and instead of the promised foundations there was still a yawning hole. "It's enough to drive one out of one's senses," said my wife in distress. "What people! What people!" In the midst of these disorderly doings the engineer arrived. He brought with him parcels of wine and savouries, and after a prolonged meal lay down for a nap in the verandah, and snored so loudly that the labourers shook their heads and said, "Well!" Masha was not pleased at his coming. She did not trust him, though at the same time she asked his advice. When, after sleeping too long after dinner, he got up in a bad humour and said unpleasant things about our management of the place, or expressed regret that he had bought Dubetchnya, which had already been a loss to him, poor Masha's face wore an expression of misery. She would complain to him, and he would yawn and say that the peasants ought to be flogged. He called our marriage and our life a farce, and said it was a caprice, a whim. "She has done something of the sort before," he said about Masha. "She once fancied herself a great opera singer and left me. I was looking for her for 2 months, and, my dear soul, I spent 1,000 roubles on telegrams alone." He no longer called me a dissenter or Mr. Painter, and did not, as in the past, express approval of my living like a workman, but said, "You are a strange person. You are not a normal person. I won't venture to prophesy, but you will come to a bad end." And Masha slept badly at night, and was always sitting at our bedroom window thinking. There was no laughter at supper now, no charming grimaces. I was wretched, and when it rained, every drop that fell seemed to pierce my heart like small shot, and I felt ready to fall on my knees before Masha and apologize for the weather. When the peasants made a noise in the yard, I felt guilty also. For hours at a time I sat still in one place, thinking of nothing but what a splendid person Masha was, what a wonderful person. I loved her passionately, and I was fascinated by everything she did, everything she said. She had a bent for quiet, studious pursuits. She was fond of reading for hours together, of studying. Although her knowledge of farming was only from books, she surprised us all by what she knew. And every piece of advice she gave was of value; not one was ever thrown away. And, with all that, what nobility, what taste, what graciousness! That graciousness which is only found in well-educated people. To this woman, with her sound, practical intelligence, the disorderly surroundings with petty cares and sordid anxieties in which we were living now were an agony. I saw that and could not sleep at night. My brain worked feverishly, and I had a lump in my throat. I rushed about not knowing what to do. I galloped to the town and brought Masha books, newspapers, sweets, flowers. With Stepan I caught fish, wading for hours up to my neck in the cold water in the rain to catch eel pout to vary our fare. I demeaned myself to beg the peasants not to make a noise. I plied them with vodka, bought them off, made all sorts of promises. And how many other foolish things I did! At last the rain ceased, the earth dried. One would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, one would go out into the garden, where there was dew sparkling on the flowers, the twitter of birds, the hum of insects, not one cloud in the sky. And the garden, the meadows, and the river were so lovely, yet there were memories of the peasants, of their carts, of the engineer. Masha and I drove out together in the racing droshky to the fields to look at the oats. She used to drive, I sat behind. Her shoulders were raised, and the wind played with her hair. "Keep to the right!" she shouted to those she met. "You are like a sledge driver," I said to her one day. "Maybe. Why, my grandfather, the engineer's father, was a sledge driver. Didn't you know that?" she asked, turning to me, and at once she mimicked the way sledge drivers shout and sing. And thank God for that, I thought as I listened to her. Thank God. And again, memories of the peasants, of the carts, of the engineer. End of chapter 12. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 13 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 13. Dr. Blagovo arrived on his bicycle. My sister began coming often. Again there were conversations about manual labour, about progress, about a mysterious millennium awaiting mankind in the remote future. The doctor did not like our farm work because it interfered with arguments. and said that ploughing, reaping, grazing calves were unworthy of a free man, and all these coarse forms of the struggle for existence men would in time relegate to animals and machines, while they would devote themselves exclusively to scientific investigation. My sister kept begging them to let her go home earlier, and if she stayed on till late in the evening, or spent the night with us, there would be no end to the agitation. "Good heavens, what a baby you are still!" said Masha reproachfully. "It is positively absurd." "Yes, it is absurd," my sister agreed. "I know it's absurd, but what is to be done if I haven't the strength to get over it? I keep feeling as though I were doing wrong." At haymaking I ached all over from the unaccustomed labour. In the evening, sitting on the verandah and talking with the others, I suddenly dropped asleep, and they laughed aloud at me. They waked me up and made me sit down to supper. I was overpowered with drowsiness, and I saw the lights, the faces, and the plates as it were in a dream, heard the voices, but did not understand them. And getting up early in the morning, I took up the scythe at once, or went to the building and worked hard all day. When I remained at home on holidays, I noticed that my sister and Masha were concealing something from me, and even seemed to be avoiding me. My wife was tender to me as before, but she had thoughts of her own apart which she did not share with me. There was no doubt that her exasperation with the peasants was growing, the life was becoming more and more distasteful to her, and yet she did not complain to me. She talked to the doctor now more readily than she did to me, and I did not understand why it was so. It was the custom in our province at haymaking and harvest time for the labourers to come to the manor house in the evening and be regaled with vodka. Even young girls drank a glass. We did not keep up this practice. The mowers and the peasant women stood about in our yard till late in the evening expecting vodka, and then departed, abusing us. And all the time Masha frowned grimly and said nothing, or murmured to the doctor with exasperation, "Savages! Pechenegs!" In the country newcomers are met ungraciously, almost with hostility, as they are at school. And we were received in this way. At first we were looked upon as stupid, silly people who had bought an estate simply because we did not know what to do with our money. We were laughed at. The peasants grazed their cattle in our wood and even in our garden. They drove away our cows and horses to the village, and then demanded money for the damage done by them. They came in whole companies into our yard and loudly clamoured that at the mowing we had cut some piece of land that did not belong to us. And as we did not yet know the boundaries of our estate very accurately, we took their word for it and paid damages. Afterwards it turned out that there had been no mistake at the mowing. They barked the lime trees in our wood. One of the Dubetchnya peasants, a regular shark, who did a trade in vodka without a license, bribed our labourers, and in collaboration with them cheated us in a most treacherous way. They took the new wheels off our carts and replaced them with old ones, stole our ploughing harness and actually sold them to us, and so on. But what was the most mortifying of all was what happened at the building. The peasant women stole by night boards, bricks, tiles, pieces of iron. The village elder, with witnesses, made a search in their huts. The village meeting fined them 2 roubles each, and afterwards this money was spent on drink by the whole commune. When Masha heard about this, she would say to the doctor or my sister indignantly, "What beasts! It's awful, awful!" And I heard her more than once express regret that she had ever taken it into her head to build the school. "You must understand," the doctor tried to persuade her, "that if you build this school and do good in general, it's not for the sake of the peasants, but in the name of culture, in the name of the future. And the worse the peasants are, the more reason for building the school. Understand that." But there was a lack of conviction in his voice, and it seemed to me that both he and Masha hated the peasants. Masha often went to the mill, taking my sister with her, and they both said, laughing, that they went to have a look at Stepan, he was so handsome. Stepan, it appeared, was torpid and taciturn only with men. In feminine society his manners were free and easy, and he talked incessantly. One day, going down to the river to bathe, I accidentally overheard a conversation. Masha and Cleopatra, both in white dresses, were sitting on the bank in the spreading shade of a willow, and Stepan was standing by them with his hands behind his back and was saying: "Are peasants men? They are not men, but, asking your pardon, wild beasts, impostors. What life has a peasant? Nothing but eating and drinking. All he cares for is victuals to be cheaper and swilling liquor at the tavern like a fool. And there's no conversation, no manners, no formality, nothing but ignorance. He lives in filth, his wife lives in filth, and his children live in filth. What he stands up in, he lies down to sleep in. He picks the potatoes out of the soup with his fingers, he drinks kvass with a cockroach in it, and doesn't bother to blow it away." "It's their poverty, of course," my sister put in. "Poverty? There is want, to be sure. There's different sorts of want, madam. If a man is in prison, or let us say blind or crippled, that really is trouble I wouldn't wish any one, but if a man's free and has all his senses, if he has his eyes and his hands and his strength and God, what more does he want? It's cockering themselves, and it's ignorance, madam, it's not poverty. If you, let us suppose, good gentlefolk, by your education, wish out of kindness to help him, he will drink away your money in his low way, or, what's worse, he will open a drink shop, and with your money start robbing the people. You say poverty, but does the rich peasant live better? He, too, asking your pardon, lives like a swine, coarse, loud-mouthed, cudgel-headed, broader than he is long, fat, red-faced mug. I'd like to swing my fist and send him flying, the scoundrel. There's Larian, another rich one at Dubetchnya, and I bet he strips the bark off your trees as much as any poor one. And he is a foul-mouthed fellow. His children are the same, and when he has had a drop too much, he'll topple with his nose in a puddle and sleep there. They are all a worthless lot, madam. If you live in a village with them, it is like hell. It has stuck in my teeth, that village has, and thank the Lord, the King of Heaven, I've plenty to eat and clothes to wear. I served out my time in the dragoons. I was village elder for 3 years, and now I am a free Cossack. I live where I like. I don't want to live in the village, and no one has the right to force me. They say, my wife, they say you are bound to live in your cottage with your wife. But why so? I am not her hired man." "Tell me, Stepan, did you marry for love?" asked Masha. "Love? Among us in the village?" answered Stepan, and he gave a laugh. "Properly speaking, madam, if you care to know, this is my second marriage. I am not a Kurilovka man, I am from Zalogosho, but afterwards I was taken into Kurilovka when I married. You see, my father did not want to divide the land among us. There were 5 of us brothers. I took my leave and went to another village to live with my wife's family, but my first wife died when she was young." "What did she die of?" "Of foolishness. She used to cry and cry and cry for no reason, and so she pined away. She was always drinking some sort of herbs to make her better looking, and I suppose she damaged her inside. And my second wife is a Kurilovka woman too, there is nothing in her. She's a village woman, a peasant woman, and nothing more. I was taken in when they plighted me to her. I thought she was young and fair-skinned, that they lived in a clean way. Her mother was just like a flagellant, and she drank coffee. And the chief thing, to be sure, they were clean in their ways. So I married her, and next day we sat down to dinner. I bade my mother-in-law give me a spoon, and she gives me a spoon, and I see her wipe it out with her finger. So much for you, thought I. Nice sort of cleanliness yours is. I lived a year with them, and then I went away. I might have married a girl from town," he went on after a pause. "They say a wife is a helpmate to her husband. What do I want with a helpmate? I help myself. I'd rather she talked to me, and not clack, 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 but circumstantially, feelingly. What is life without good conversation?" Stepan suddenly paused, and at once there was the sound of his dreary, monotonous "oo-loo-loo-loo." This meant that he had seen me. Masha used often to go to the mill, and evidently found pleasure in her conversations with Stepan. Stepan abused the peasants with such sincerity and conviction, and she was attracted to him. Every time she came back from the mill, the feeble-minded peasant who looked after the garden shouted at her, "Wench Palashka! Hullo, wench Palaska!" and he would bark like a dog, "Ga! Ga!" and she would stop and look at him attentively, as though in that idiot's barking she found an answer to her thoughts, and probably he attracted her in the same way as Stepan's abuse. At home some piece of news would await her, such, for instance, as that the geese from the village had ruined our cabbage in the garden, or that Larian had stolen the reins. And shrugging her shoulders, she would say with a laugh, "What do you expect of these people?" She was indignant, and there was rancour in her heart, and meanwhile I was growing used to the peasants, and I felt more and more drawn to them. For the most part they were nervous, irritable, downtrodden people. They were people whose imagination had been stifled, ignorant, with a poor, dingy outlook on life, whose thoughts were ever the same, of the grey earth, of grey days, of black bread, people who cheated, but like birds hiding nothing but their head behind the tree, people who could not count. They would not come to mow for us for 20 roubles, but they came for half a pail of vodka, though for 20 roubles they could have bought 4 pails. There really was filth and drunkenness and foolishness and deceit, but with all that one yet felt that the life of the peasants rested on a firm, sound foundation. However uncouth a wild animal the peasant following the plough seemed, and however he might stupefy himself with vodka, still, looking at him more closely, one felt that there was in him what was needed, something very important, which was lacking in Masha and in the doctor, for instance, and that was that he believed the chief thing on earth was truth and justice, and that his salvation, and that of the whole people, was only to be found in truth and justice. And so more than anything in the world he loved just dealing. I told my wife she saw the spots on the glass, but not the glass itself. She said nothing in reply, or hummed like Stepan, "Oo-loo-loo-loo." When this good-hearted and clever woman turned pale with indignation, and with a quiver in her voice spoke to the doctor of the drunkenness and dishonesty, it perplexed me, and I was struck by the shortness of her memory. How could she forget that her father the engineer drank too, and drank heavily, and that the money with which Dubetchnya had been bought had been acquired by a whole series of shameless, impudent dishonesties? How could she forget it? End of chapter 13. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 14 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 14. My sister, too, was leading a life of her own, which she carefully hid from me. She was often whispering with Masha. When I went up to her, she seemed to shrink into herself, and there was a guilty, imploring look in her eyes. Evidently there was something going on in her heart of which she was afraid or ashamed. So as to avoid meeting me in the garden, or being left alone with me, she always kept close to Masha, and I rarely had an opportunity of talking to her except at dinner. One evening I was walking quietly through the garden on my way back from the building. It was beginning to get dark. Without noticing me or hearing my step, my sister was walking near a spreading old apple tree, absolutely noiselessly, as though she were a phantom. She was dressed in black, and was walking rapidly backwards and forwards on the same track, looking at the ground. An apple fell from the tree. She started at the sound, stood still, and pressed her hands to her temples. At that moment I went up to her. In a rush of tender affection which suddenly flooded my heart, with tears in my eyes, suddenly remembering my mother and our childhood, I put my arm round her shoulders and kissed her. "What is the matter?" I asked her. "You are unhappy, I have seen it for a long time. Tell me what's wrong." "I am frightened," she said, trembling. "What is it?" I insisted. "For God's sake, be open." "I will. I will be open. I will tell you the whole truth. To hide it from you is so hard, so agonizing. Misail, I love..." she went on in a whisper. "I love him. I love him. I am happy, but why am I so frightened?" There was a sound of footsteps. Between the trees appeared Dr. Blagovo in his silk shirt with his high-top boots. Evidently they had arranged to meet near the apple tree. Seeing him, she rushed impulsively towards him with a cry of pain, as though he were being taken from her. "Vladimir, Vladimir!" She clung to him and looked greedily into his face, and only then I noticed how pale and thin she had become of late. It was particularly noticeable from her lace collar, which I had known for so long, and which now hung more loosely than ever before about her thin, long neck. The doctor was disconcerted, but at once recovered himself and, stroking her hair, said, "There, there, why so nervous? You see, I'm here." We were silent, looking with embarrassment at each other, then we walked on, the three of us together, and I heard the doctor say to me: "Civilized life has not yet begun among us. Old men console themselves by making out that if there is nothing new, there was something in the 'forties or the 'sixties. That's the old. You and I are young. Our brains have not yet been touched by marasmus senilis. We cannot comfort ourselves with such illusions. The beginning of Russia was in 862, but the beginning of civilized Russia has not come yet." But I did not grasp the meaning of these reflections. It was somehow strange, I could not believe it, that my sister was in love, that she was walking and holding the arm of a stranger and looking tenderly at him. My sister, this nervous, frightened, crushed, fettered creature, loved a man who was married and had children! I felt sorry for something, but what exactly I don't know. The presence of the doctor was for some reason distasteful to me now, and I could not imagine what would come of this love of theirs. End of chapter 14. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 15 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 15. Masha and I drove to Kurilovka to the dedication of the school. "Autumn, autumn, autumn," said Masha softly, looking away. "Summer is over. There are no birds and nothing is green but the willows." Yes, summer was over. There were fine, warm days, but it was fresh in the morning, and the shepherds went out in their sheepskins already. And in our garden the dew did not dry off the asters all day long. There were plaintive sounds all the time, and one could not make out whether they came from the shutters creaking on their rusty hinges or from the flying cranes, and one's heart felt light, and one was eager for life. "The summer is over," said Masha. "Now you and I can balance our accounts. We have done a lot of work, a lot of thinking. We are the better for it. All honour and glory to us. We have succeeded in self-improvement. But have our successes had any perceptible influence on the life around us? Have they brought any benefit to anyone whatever? No. Ignorance, physical uncleanliness, drunkenness, an appallingly high infant mortality, everything remains as it was, and no one is the better for your having ploughed and sown, and my having wasted money and read books. Obviously we have been working only for ourselves, and have had advanced ideas only for ourselves." Such reasonings perplexed me, and I did not know what to think. "We have been sincere from beginning to end," said I, "and if any one is sincere he is right." "Who disputes it? We were right, but we haven't succeeded in properly accomplishing what we were right in. To begin with, our external methods themselves, aren't they mistaken? You want to be of use to men, but by the very fact of your buying an estate, from the very start you cut yourself off from any possibility of doing anything useful for them. Then if you work, dress, eat like a peasant, you sanctify, as it were, by your authority, their heavy, clumsy dress, their horrible huts, their stupid beards. On the other hand, if we suppose that you work for long, long years, your whole life, that in the end some practical results are obtained, yet what are they, your results? What can they do against such elemental forces as wholesale ignorance, hunger, cold, degeneration? A drop in the ocean. Other methods of struggle are needed, strong, bold, rapid. If one really wants to be of use, one must get out of the narrow circle of ordinary social work and try to act direct upon the mass. What is wanted, first of all, is a loud, energetic propaganda. Why is it that art, music for instance, is so living, so popular, and in reality so powerful? Because the musician or the singer affects thousands at once. Precious, precious art," she went on, looking dreamily at the sky. "Art gives us wings and carries us far, far away. Any one who is sick of filth, of petty, mercenary interests, any one who is revolted, wounded, and indignant, can find peace and satisfaction only in the beautiful." When we drove into Kurilovka, the weather was bright and joyous. Somewhere they were threshing. There was a smell of rye straw. A mountain ash was bright red behind the hurdle fences, and all the trees, wherever one looked, were ruddy or golden. They were ringing the bells, they were carrying the ikons to school, and we could hear them sing, "Holy Mother, our Defender," and how limpid the air was, and how high the doves were flying. The service was being held in the classroom. Then the peasants of Kurilovka brought Masha the ikon, and the peasants of Dubetchnya offered her a big loaf and a gilt salt cellar. And Masha broke into sobs. "If anything has been said that shouldn't have been, or anything done not to your liking, forgive us," said an old man, and he bowed down to her and to me. As we drove home, Masha kept looking round at the school. The green roof which I had painted, and which was glistening in the sun, remained in sight for a long while, and I felt that the look Masha turned upon it now was one of farewell. End of chapter 15. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 16 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 16. In the evening she got ready to go to the town. Of late she had taken to going often to the town and staying the night there. In her absence I could not work, my hands felt weak and limp. Our huge courtyard seemed a dreary, repulsive, empty hole. The garden was full of angry noises, and without her, the house, the trees, the horses were no longer ours. I did not go out of the house, but went on sitting at her table, beside her bookshelf with the books on land work, those old favourites no longer wanted, and looking at me now so shamefacedly. For whole hours together, while it struck 7, 8, 9, while the autumn night, black as soot, came on outside, I kept examining her old glove, or the pen with which she always wrote, or her little scissors. I did nothing, and realized clearly that all I had done before, ploughing, mowing, chopping, had only been because she wished it. And if she had sent me to clean a deep well, where I had to stand up to my waist in deep water, I should have crawled into the well without considering whether it was necessary or not. And now when she was not near, Dubetchnya, with its ruins, its untidiness, its banging shutters, with its thieves by day and by night, seemed to me a chaos in which any work would be useless. Besides, what had I to work for here? Why anxiety and thought about the future, if I felt that the earth was giving way under my feet, that I had played my part at Dubetchnya, and that the fate of the books on farming was awaiting me too? Oh, what misery it was at night, in hours of solitude, when I was listening every minute in alarm, as though I were expecting someone to shout that it was time for me to go away. I did not grieve for Dubetchnya. I grieved for my love, which, too, was threatened with its autumn. What an immense happiness it is to love and be loved, and how awful to feel that one is slipping down from that high pinnacle. Masha returned from the town towards the evening of the next day. She was displeased with something, but she concealed it, and only said, "Why was it all the window frames had been put in for the winter? It was enough to suffocate one." I took out 2 frames. We were not hungry, but we sat down to supper. "Go and wash your hands," said my wife. "You smell of putty." She had brought some new illustrated papers from the town, and we looked at them together after supper. There were supplements with fashion plates and patterns. Masha looked through them casually, and was putting them aside to examine them properly later on, but one dress, with a flat skirt as full as a bell and large sleeves, interested her, and she looked at it for a minute gravely and attentively. "That's not bad," she said. "Yes, that dress would suit you beautifully," I said. "Beautifully." And looking with emotion at the dress, admiring that patch of grey simply because she liked it, I went on tenderly: "A charming, exquisite dress! Splendid, glorious Masha! My precious Masha!" And tears dropped on the fashion plate. "Splendid Masha," I muttered. "Sweet, precious Masha." She went to bed while I sat another hour looking at the illustrations. "It's a pity you took out the window frames," she said from the bedroom. "I am afraid it may be cold. Oh dear, what a draught there is!" I read something out of the column of odds and ends, a receipt for making cheap ink, and an account of the biggest diamond in the world. I came again upon the fashion plate of the dress she liked, and I imagined her at a ball, with a fan, bare shoulders, brilliant, splendid, with a full understanding of painting, music, literature, and how small and how brief my part seemed. Our meeting, our marriage, had been only one of the episodes, of which there would be many more, in the life of this vital, richly gifted woman. All the best in the world, as I have said already, was at her service, and she received it absolutely for nothing, and even ideas in the intellectual movement in vogue served simply for her recreation, giving variety to her life, and I was only the sledge driver who drove her from one entertainment to another. Now she did not need me; she would take flight, and I should be alone. And as though in response to my thought there came a despairing scream from the garden. "Help!" It was a shrill, womanish voice, and as though to mimic it, the wind whistled in the chimney on the same shrill note. Half a minute passed, and again through the noise of the wind, but coming, it seemed, from the other end of the yard, "Help!" "Misail, do you hear?" my wife asked me softly. "Do you hear?" She came out from the bedroom in her nightgown, with her hair down, and listened, looking at the dark window. "Someone is being murdered," she said. "That is the last straw." I took my gun and went out. It was very dark outside, the wind was high, and it was difficult to stand. I went to the gate and listened. The trees roared, the wind whistled, and, probably at the feeble-minded peasants, a dog howled lazily. Outside the gates the darkness was absolute, not a light on the railway line. And near the lodge, which a year before had been the office, suddenly sounded a smothered scream. "Help!" "Who's there?" I called. There were two people struggling. One was thrusting the other out, while the other was resisting, and both were breathing heavily. "Leave go!" said one, and I recognized Ivan Tcheprakov. It was he who was shrieking in a shrill, womanish voice: "Let go, you damned brute, or I'll bite your hand off!" The other I recognized as Moisey. I separated them, and as I did so I could not resist hitting Moisey 2 blows in the face. He fell down, then got up again, and I hit him once more. "He tried to kill me," he muttered. "He was trying to get at his mamma's chest. I want to lock him up in the lodge for security." Tcheprakov was drunk and did not recognize me. He kept drawing deep breaths, as though he were just going to shout "Help!" again. I left them and went back to the house. My wife was lying on her bed. She had dressed. I told her what had happened in the yard, and did not conceal the fact that I had hit Moisey. "It's terrible to live in the country," she said. "And what a long night it is! Oh dear, if only it were over!" "Help!" we heard again, a little later. "I'll go and stop them," I said. "No, let them bite each other's throats," she said, with an expression of disgust. She was looking up at the ceiling, listening, while I sat beside her, not daring to speak to her, feeling as though I were to blame for their shouting "Help!" in the yard, and for the night seeming so long. We were silent, and I waited impatiently for a gleam of light at the window, and Masha looked all the time as though she had awakened from a trance, and now was marvelling how she, so clever and well educated, so elegant, had come into this pitiful, provincial, empty hole among a crew of petty, insignificant people, and how she could have so far forgotten herself as ever to be attracted by one of these people, and for more than 6 months to have been his wife. It seemed to me that at that moment it did not matter to her whether it was I or Moisey or Tcheprakov. Everything for her was merged in that savage, drunken "Help!" I and our marriage and our work together and the mud and slush of autumn. And when she sighed or moved into a more comfortable position, I read in her face, "Oh, that morning would come quickly!" In the morning she went away. I spent another 3 days at Dubetchnya expecting her, then I packed all our things in one room, locked it, and walked to the town. It was already evening when I rang at the engineers, and the street lamps were burning in Great Dvoryansky Street. Pavel told me there was no one at home. Viktor Ivanitch had gone to Petersburg, and Maria Viktorovna was probably at the rehearsal at the Azhogins'. I remember with what emotion I went on to the Azhogins', how my heart throbbed and fluttered as I mounted the stairs, and stood waiting a long while on the landing at the top, not daring to enter that temple of the Muses. In the big room there were lighted candles everywhere, on a little table, on the piano, and on the stage, everywhere in threes, and the first performance was fixed for the 13th, and now the first rehearsal was on a Monday, an unlucky day. All part of the war against superstition. All the devotees of the scenic art were gathered together, the eldest, the middle, and the youngest sisters were walking about the stage, reading their parts in exercise books. Apart from all the rest stood Radish, motionless, with the side of his head pressed to the wall, as he gazed with adoration at the stage, waiting for the rehearsal to begin. Everything as it used to be. I was making my way to my hostess. I had to pay my respects to her, but suddenly every one said "Hush!" and waved me to step quietly. There was a silence. The lid of the piano was raised. A lady sat down at it, screwing up her short-sighted eyes at the music, and my Masha walked up to the piano in a low-necked dress, looking beautiful, but with a special new sort of beauty not in the least like the Masha who used to come and meet me in the spring, at the mill. She sang, "Why do I love the radiant night?" It was the first time during our whole acquaintance that I had heard her sing. She had a fine, mellow, powerful voice, and while she sang I felt as though I were eating a ripe, sweet, fragrant melon. She ended, the audience applauded, and she smiled, very much pleased, making play with her eyes, turning over the music, smoothing her skirts, like a bird that has at last broken out of its cage and preens its wings in freedom. Her hair was arranged over her ears, and she had an unpleasant, defiant expression in her face, as though she wanted to throw down a challenge to us all, or to shout to us as she did to her horses, "Hey there, my beauties!" And she must at that moment have been very much like her grandfather, the sledge driver. "You here too?" she said, giving me her hand. "Did you hear me sing? Well, what did you think of it?" And without waiting for my answer, she went on: "It's a very good thing you are here. I am going to night to Petersburg for a short time. You'll let me go, won't you?" At midnight I went with her to the station. She embraced me affectionately, probably feeling grateful to me for not asking unnecessary questions, and she promised to write to me, and I held her hands a long time and kissed them, hardly able to restrain my tears and not uttering a word. And when she had gone I stood watching the retreating lights, caressing her in imagination, and softly murmuring, "My darling Masha, glorious Masha." I spent the night at Karpovna's, and next morning I was at work with Radish, recovering the furniture of a rich merchant who was marrying his daughter to a doctor. End of chapter 16. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 17 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton CHEKHOV, translated by Constance GARNETT, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 17. My sister came after dinner on Sunday and had tea with me. "I read a great deal now," she said, showing me the books which she had fetched from the public library on her way to me. "Thanks to your wife and to Vladimir, they have awakened me to self-realization. They have been my salvation. They have made me feel myself a human being. In old days I used to lie awake at night with worries of all sorts, thinking what a lot of sugar we had used in the week, or hoping the cucumbers would not be too salt. And now, too, I lie awake at night, but I have different thoughts. I am distressed that half my life has been passed in such a foolish, cowardly way. I despise my past, I am ashamed of it. And I look upon our father now as my enemy. Oh, how grateful I am to your wife and Vladimir! He is such a wonderful person. They have opened my eyes." "That's bad that you don't sleep at night," I said. "Do you think I am ill? Not at all. Vladimir sounded me and said I was perfectly well. But health is not what matters. It is not so important. Tell me, am I right?" She needed moral support, that was obvious. Masha had gone away. Dr. Blagovo was in Petersburg, and there was no one left in the town but me to tell her she was right. She looked intently into my face, trying to read my secret thoughts. and if I were absorbed or silent in her presence, she thought this was on her account and was grieved. I always had to be on my guard, and when she asked me whether she was right, I hastened to assure her that she was right, and that I had a deep respect for her. "Do you know they have given me a part at the Azhogins'?" she went on. "I want to act on the stage, I want to live. In fact, I mean to drain the full cup. I have no talent, none, and the part is only 10 lines, but still this is immeasurably finer and loftier than pouring out tea 5 times a day and looking to see if the cook has eaten too much. Above all, let my father see I am capable of protest." After tea she lay down on my bed and lay for a little while with her eyes closed, looking very pale. "What weakness!" she said, getting up. "Vladimir says all city-bred women and girls are anemic from doing nothing. What a clever man Vladimir is! He is right, absolutely right. We must work." 2 days later she came to the Azhogins' with her manuscript for the rehearsal. She was wearing a black dress with a string of coral round her neck, and a brooch that in the distance was like a pastry puff, and in her ears earrings sparkling with brilliants. When I looked at her I felt uncomfortable, I was struck by her lack of taste. That she had very inappropriately put on earrings and brilliants, and that she was strangely dressed, was remarked by other people too. I saw smiles on people's faces and heard someone say with a laugh, "Cleopatra of Egypt." She was trying to assume society manners, to be unconstrained and at her ease, and so seemed artificial and strange. She had lost simplicity and sweetness. "I told father just now that I was going to the rehearsal," she began, coming up to me, "and he shouted that he would not give me his blessing, and actually almost struck me. Only fancy, I don't know my part," she said, looking at her manuscript. "I am sure to make a mess of it. So be it. The die is cast," she went on in intense excitement. "The die is cast." It seemed to her that every one was looking at her, and that all were amazed at the momentous step she had taken, that every one was expecting something special of her, and it would have been impossible to convince her that no one was paying attention to people so petty and insignificant as she and I were. She had nothing to do till the third act, and her part, that of a visitor, a provincial crony, consisted only in standing at the door as though listening, and then delivering a brief monologue. In the interval before her appearance, an hour and a half at least, while they were moving about on the stage, reading their parts, drinking tea and arguing, she did not leave my side, and was all the time muttering her part and nervously crumpling up the manuscript. And imagining that every one was looking at her and waiting for her appearance, with a trembling hand she smoothed back her hair and said to me, "I shall certainly make a mess of it. What a load on my heart, if only you knew! I feel frightened, as though I were just going to be led to execution." At last her turn came. "Cleopatra Alexeyevna, it's your cue," said the stage manager. She came forward into the middle of the stage with an expression of horror on her face, looking ugly and angular, and for half a minute stood as though in a trance, perfectly motionless, and only her big earrings shook in her ears. "The first time you can read it," said someone. It was clear to me that she was trembling, and trembling so much that she could not speak, and could not unfold her manuscript, and that she was incapable of acting her part, and I was already on the point of going to her and saying something, when she suddenly dropped on her knees in the middle of the stage and broke into loud sobs. All was commotion and hubbub. I alone stood still, leaning against the side scene, overwhelmed by what had happened, not understanding and not knowing what to do. I saw them lift her up and lead her away. I saw Anyuta Blagovo come up to me. I had not seen her in the room before, and she seemed to have sprung out of the earth. She was wearing her hat and veil, and, as always, had an air of having come only for a moment. "I told her not to take a part," she said angrily, jerking out each word abruptly, and turning crimson. "It's insanity. You ought to have prevented her." Madame Azhogin, in a short jacket with short sleeves, with cigarette ash on her breast, looking thin and flat, came rapidly towards me. "My dear, this is terrible," she brought out, wringing her hands, and, as her habit was, looking intently into my face. "This is terrible. Your sister is in a condition. She is with child. Take her away, I implore you." She was breathless with agitation, while on one side stood her 3 daughters exactly like her, thin and flat, huddling together in a scared way. They were alarmed, overwhelmed, as though a convict had been caught in their house. What a disgrace! How dreadful! And yet this estimable family had spent its life waging war on superstition. Evidently they imagined that all the superstition and error of humanity was limited to the 3 candles, the 13th of the month, and to the unluckiness of Monday. "I beg you, I beg," repeated Madame Ozhogin, pursing up her lips in the shape of a heart on the syllable "you." "I beg you to take her home." End of chapter 17. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 18 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 18. A little later my sister and I were walking along the street. I covered her with the skirts of my coat. We hastened, choosing back streets where there were no street lamps, avoiding passers-by. It was as though we were running away. She was no longer crying, but looked at me with dry eyes. To Karpovna's, where I took her, it was only 20 minutes' walk. And strange to say, in that short time we succeeded in thinking of our whole life. We talked over everything, considered our position, reflected. We decided we could not go on living in this town, and that when I had earned a little money we would move to some other place. In some houses every one was asleep, in others they were playing cards. We hated these houses, we were afraid of them. We talked of the fanaticism, the coarseness of feeling, the insignificance of these respectable families, these amateurs of dramatic art whom we had so alarmed, and I kept asking in what way these stupid, cruel, lazy, and dishonest people were superior to the drunken and superstitious peasants of Kurilovka, or in what way they were better than animals, who, in the same way, are thrown into a panic when some incident disturbs the monotony of their life, limited by their instincts. What would have happened to my sister now if she had been left to live at home? What moral agonies would she have experienced, talking with my father, meeting every day with acquaintances? I imagined this to myself, and at once there came into my mind people, all people I knew, who had been slowly done to death by their nearest relations. I remembered the tortured dogs, driven mad, the live sparrows plucked naked by boys and flung into the water, and a long, long series of obscure, lingering miseries which I had looked on continually from early childhood in that town. And I could not understand what these 60,000 people lived for, what they read the Gospel for, why they prayed, why they read books and magazines. What good had they gained from all that had been said and written hitherto if they were still possessed by the same spiritual darkness and hatred of liberty as they were 100 and 300 years ago? A master carpenter spends his whole life building houses in the town, and always, to the day of his death, calls a gallery a galdery. So these 60,000 people have been reading and hearing of truth, of justice, of mercy, of freedom for generations, and yet from morning till night, till the day of their death, they are lying and tormenting each other, and they fear liberty and hate it as a deadly foe. "And so my fate is decided," said my sister as we arrived home. "After what has happened I cannot go back there. Heavens, how good that is! My heart feels lighter." She went to bed at once. Tears were glittering on her eyelashes, but her expression was happy. She fell into a sound, sweet sleep, and one could see that her heart was lighter and that she was resting. It was a long, long time since she had slept like that. And so we began our life together. She was always singing, and saying that her heart was very happy. And the books I brought her from the public library I took back unread, as now she could not read. She wanted to do nothing but dream and talk of the future, mending my linen or helping Karpovna near the stove. She was always singing, or talking of her Vladimir, of his cleverness, of his charming manners, of his kindness, of his extraordinary learning, and I assented to all she said, though by now I disliked her doctor. She wanted to work, to lead an independent life on her own account, and she used to say that she would become a schoolteacher or a doctor's assistant as soon as her health would permit her, and would herself do the scrubbing and the washing. Already she was passionately devoted to her child. He was not yet born, but she knew already the colour of his eyes, what his hands would be like, and how he would laugh. She was fond of talking about education, and as her Vladimir was the best man in the world, all her discussion of education could be summed up in the question how to make the boy as fascinating as his father. There was no end to her talk, and everything she said made her intensely joyful. Sometimes I was delighted too, though I could not have said why. I suppose her dreaminess infected me. I, too, gave up reading, and did nothing but dream. In the evenings, in spite of my fatigue, I walked up and down the room with my hands in my pockets, talking of Masha. "What do you think?" I would ask of my sister. "When will she come back? I think she'll come back at Christmas, not later. What has she to do there?" "Well, as she doesn't write to you, it's evident she will come back very soon." "That's true," I assented, though I knew perfectly well that Masha would not return to our town. I missed her fearfully, and could no longer deceive myself, and tried to get other people to deceive me. My sister was expecting her doctor, and I Masha, and both of us talked incessantly, laughed, and did not notice that we were preventing Karpovna from sleeping. She lay on the stove and kept muttering: "The samovar hummed this morning. It did hum. Oh, it bodes no good, my dears, it bodes no good." No one ever came to see us but the postman, who brought my sister letters from the doctor, and Prokofy, who sometimes came in to see us in the evening. And after looking at my sister without speaking, went away, and when he was in the kitchen said: "Every class ought to remember its rules, and any one who is so proud that he won't understand that will find it a vale of tears." He was very fond of the phrase "a vale of tears." One day, it was in Christmas week, when I was walking by the bazaar, he called me into the butcher's shop, and not shaking hands with me, announced that he had to speak to me about something very important. His face was red from the frost and vodka. Near him, behind the counter, stood Nikolka, with the expression of a brigand, holding a blood-stained knife in his hand. "I desire to express my word to you," Prokofy began. "This incident cannot continue, because, as you understand yourself, that for such a vale people will say nothing good of you or of us. Mamma, through pity, cannot say something unpleasant to you, that your sister should move into another lodging on account of her condition. But I won't have it any more, because I can't approve of her behaviour." I understood him, and I went out of the shop. The same day my sister and I moved to Radish's. We had no money for a cab, and we walked on foot. I carried a parcel of our belongings on my back. My sister had nothing in her hands, but she gasped for breath and coughed, and kept asking whether we should get there soon. End of chapter 18. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 19 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 19. At last a letter came from Masha. "Dear, good M.A.," she wrote, "our kind, gentle angel, as the old painter calls you, farewell. I am going with my father to America for the exhibition. In a few days I shall see the ocean, so far from Dubetchnya it's dreadful to think. It's far and unfathomable as the sky, and I long to be there in freedom. I am triumphant, I am mad, and you see how incoherent my letter is. Dear, good one, give me my freedom, make haste to break the thread which still holds, binding you and me together. My meeting and knowing you was a ray from heaven that lighted up my existence, but my becoming your wife was a mistake, you understand that, and I am oppressed now by the consciousness of the mistake, and I beseech you on my knees, my generous friend, quickly, quickly, before I start for the ocean, telegraph that you consent to correct our common mistake, to remove the solitary stone from my wings, and my father, who will undertake all the arrangements, promised me not to burden you too much with formalities. And so I am free to fly whither I will? Yes? Be happy and God bless you. Forgive me, a sinner. I am well, I am wasting money, doing all sorts of silly things, and I thank God every minute that such a bad woman as I has no children. I sing and have success, but it's not an infatuation. No, it's my haven, my cell to which I go for peace. King David had a ring with an inscription on it: "All things pass." When one is sad, those words make one cheerful, and when one is cheerful, it makes one sad. I have got myself a ring like that with Hebrew letters on it, and this talisman keeps me from infatuations. All things pass. Life will pass. One wants nothing. Or at least one wants nothing but the sense of freedom, for when anyone is free, he wants nothing, nothing, nothing. Break the thread. A warm hug to you and your sister. Forgive and forget your M. My sister used to lie down in one room, and Radish, who had been ill again and was now better, in another. Just at the moment when I received this letter, my sister went softly into the painter's room, sat down beside him, and began reading aloud. She read to him every day, Ostrovsky or Gogol, and he listened, staring at one point, not laughing, but shaking his head and muttering to himself from time to time, "Anything may happen, anything may happen." If anything ugly or unseemly were depicted in the play, he would say as though vindictively, thrusting his finger into the book, "There it is, lying! That's what it does, lying does!" The plays fascinated him, both from their subjects and their moral, and from their skilful complex construction, and he marvelled at him, never calling the author by his name. How neatly he has put it all together. This time my sister read softly only one page, and could read no more. Her face would not last out. Radish took her hand, and moving his parched lips, said, hardly audibly, in a husky voice, "The soul of a righteous man is white and smooth as chalk, but the soul of a sinful man is like pumice stone. The soul of a righteous man is like clear oil, but the soul of a sinful man is gas tar. We must labour, we must sorrow, we must suffer sickness," he went on, "and he who does not labour and sorrow will not gain the kingdom of heaven. Woe, woe to them that are well fed! Woe to the mighty! Woe to the rich! Woe to the money lenders! Not for them is the kingdom of heaven. Lice eat grass, rust eats iron. And lying the soul," my sister added, laughing. I read the letter through once more. At that moment there walked into the kitchen a soldier who had been bringing us twice a week parcels of tea, French bread and game, which smelt of scent, from some unknown giver. I had no work. I had had to sit at home idle for whole days together, and probably whoever sent us the French bread knew that we were in want. I heard my sister talking to the soldier and laughing gaily. Then, lying down, she ate some French bread and said to me: "When you wouldn't go into the service, but became a house painter, Aniuta Blagovo and I knew from the beginning that you were right, but we were frightened to say so aloud. Tell me, what force is it that hinders us from saying what one thinks? Take Aniuta Blagovo now, for instance. She loves you, she adores you, she knows you are right, she loves me too, like a sister, and knows that I am right, and I dare say in her soul envies me. But some force prevents her from coming to see us, she shuns us, she is afraid." My sister crossed her arms over her breast and said passionately: "How she loves you, if only you knew! She has confessed her love to no one but me, and then very secretly in the dark. She led me into a dark avenue in the garden and began whispering how precious you were to her. You will see, she'll never marry, because she loves you. Are you sorry for her?" "Yes." "It's she who has sent the bread. She is absurd, really. What is the use of being so secret? I used to be absurd and foolish, but now I have got away from that, and am afraid of nobody. I think and say aloud what I like, and am happy. When I lived at home I hadn't a conception of happiness, and now I wouldn't change with a queen." Dr. Blagovo arrived. He had taken his doctor's degree and was now staying in our town with his father. He was taking a rest, and said that he would soon go back to Petersburg again. He wanted to study antitoxins against typhus, and I believe cholera. He wanted to go abroad to perfect his training, and then to be appointed a professor. He had already left the army service, and wore a roomy serge reefer jacket, very full trousers, and magnificent neckties. My sister was in ecstasies over his scarf pin, his studs, and the red silk handkerchief which he wore, I suppose from foppishness, sticking out of the breast pocket of his jacket. One day, having nothing to do, she and I counted up all the suits we remembered him wearing, and came to the conclusion that he had at least 10. It was clear that he still loved my sister as before, but he never once, even in jest, spoke of taking her with him to Petersburg or abroad. and I could not picture to myself clearly what would become of her if she remained alive, and what would become of her child. She did nothing but dream endlessly, and I could not picture to myself clearly what would become of her if she remained alive, and what would become of her child. She did nothing but dream endlessly, and never thought seriously of the future. She said he might go where he liked, and might abandon her even, so long as he was happy himself, that what had been was enough for her. As a rule, he used to sound her very carefully on his arrival, and used to insist on her taking milk in drops in his presence. It was the same on this occasion. He sounded her and made her drink a glass of milk, and there was a smell of creosote in our room afterwards. "That's a good girl," he said, taking the glass from her. "You mustn't talk too much now. You've taken to chattering like a magpie of late. Please hold your tongue." She laughed. Then he came into Radish's room where I was sitting, and affectionately slapped me on the shoulder. "Well, how goes it, old man?" he said, bending down to the invalid. "Your honour," said Radish, moving his lips slowly. "Your honour, I venture to submit. We all walk in the fear of God. We all have to die. Permit me to tell you the truth. Your honour, the kingdom of heaven will not be for you." "There's no help for it," the doctor said, jestingly. "There must be somebody in hell, you know." And all at once something happened with my consciousness, as though I were in a dream, as though I were standing on a winter night in the slaughter-house yard, and Prokofy beside me, smelling of pepper cordial. I made an effort to control myself, and rubbed my eyes, and at once it seemed to me that I was going along the road to the interview with the governor. Nothing of the sort had happened to me before, or has happened to me since, and these strange memories that were like dreams I ascribed to over-exhaustion of my nerves. I lived through the scene at the slaughter-house and the interview with the governor, and at the same time was dimly aware that it was not real. When I came to myself I saw that I was no longer in the house, but in the street, and was standing with the doctor near a lamp-post. It's sad," he was saying, and tears were trickling down his cheeks. "She is in good spirits, she's always laughing and hopeful, but her position's hopeless, dear boy. Your Radish hates me, and is always trying to make me feel that I have treated her badly. He is right from his standpoint, but I have my point of view too, and I shall never regret all that has happened. One must love. We ought all to love, oughtn't we? There would be no life without love. Anyone who fears and avoids love is not free." Little by little he passed to other subjects, began talking of science, of his dissertation which had been liked in Petersburg. He was carried away by his subject, and no longer thought of my sister, nor of his grief, nor of me. Life was of absorbing interest to him. "She has America and her ring with the inscription on it," I thought, "while this fellow has his doctor's degree and a professor's chair to look forward to, and only my sister and I are left with the old things." When I said good-bye to him, I went up to the lamp-post and read the letter once more. And I remembered vividly how that spring morning she had come to me at the mill, lain down and covered herself with her jacket. She wanted to be like a simple peasant woman. And how another time, it was in the morning also, we drew the net out of the water, and heavy drops of rain fell upon us from the riverside willows, and we laughed. It was dark in our house in Great Dvoryansky Street. I got over the fence and, as I used to do in the old days, went by the back way to the kitchen to borrow a lantern. There was no one in the kitchen. The samovar hissed near the stove, waiting for my father. "Who pours out my father's tea now?" I thought. Taking the lantern, I went out to the shed, built myself up a bed of old newspapers, and lay down. The hooks on the walls looked forbidding, as they used to of old, and their shadows flickered. It was cold. I felt that my sister would come in a minute, and bring me supper, but at once I remembered that she was ill and was lying at Radish's, and it seemed to me strange that I should have climbed over the fence and be lying here in this unheated shed. My mind was in a maze, and I saw all sorts of absurd things. There was a ring familiar from childhood. First the wire rustled against the wall, then a short plaintive ring in the kitchen. It was my father come back from the club. I got up and went into the kitchen. Aksinya, the cook, clasped her hands on seeing me, and for some reason burst into tears. "My own," she said softly, "my precious, oh Lord!" And she began crumpling up her apron in her agitation. In the window there were standing jars of berries and vodka. I poured myself out a teacupful and greedily drank it off, for I was intensely thirsty. Aksenia had quite recently scrubbed the table and benches, and there was that smell in the kitchen which is found in bright, snug kitchens kept by tidy cooks. And that smell and the chirp of the cricket used to lure us as children into the kitchen, and put us in the mood for hearing fairy tales and playing at kings. "Where's Cleopatra?" Aksenia asked softly, in a fluster, holding her breath. "And where is your cap, my dear? Your wife, you say, has gone to Petersburg?" She had been our servant in our mother's time, and used once to give Cleopatra and me our baths, and to her we were still children who had to be talked to for their good. For a quarter of an hour or so she laid before me all the reflections which she had, with the sagacity of an old servant, been accumulating in the stillness of that kitchen all the time since we had seen each other. She said that the doctor could be forced to marry Cleopatra; he only needed to be thoroughly frightened, and that if an appeal were promptly written the bishop would annul the first marriage; that it would be a good thing for me to sell Dubetchnya without my wife's knowledge and put the money in the bank in my own name; that if my sister and I were to bow down at my father's feet and ask him properly, he might perhaps forgive us; that we ought to have a service sung to the Queen of Heaven. "Come, go along, my dear, and speak to him," she said when she heard my father's cough. "Go along, speak to him. Bow down, your head won't drop off." I went in. My father was sitting at the table sketching a plan of a summer villa with Gothic windows, and with a fat turret like a fireman's watch tower, something peculiarly stiff and tasteless. Going into the study, I stood still where I could see this drawing. I did not know why I had gone in to my father, but I remember that when I saw his lean face, his red neck, and his shadow on the wall, I wanted to throw myself on his neck, and, as Aksenia had told me, bow down at his feet. But the sight of the summer villa with the Gothic windows and the fat turret restrained me. "Good evening," I said. He glanced at me, and at once dropped his eyes on his drawing. "What do you want?" he asked, after waiting a little. "I have come to tell you my sister is very ill. She can't live very long," I added in a hollow voice. "Well," sighed my father, taking off his spectacles and laying them on the table, "what thou sowest, that shalt thou reap. What thou sowest," he repeated, getting up from the table, "that shalt thou reap. I ask you to remember how you came to me 2 years ago, and on this very spot I begged you, I besought you to give up your errors. I reminded you of your duty, of your honour, of what you owed to your forefathers, whose traditions we ought to preserve as sacred. Did you obey me? You scorned my counsels, and obstinately persisted in clinging to your false ideals. Worse still, you drew your sister into the path of error with you, and led her to lose her moral principles and sense of shame. Now you are both in a bad way. Well, as thou sowest, so shalt thou reap." As he said this he walked up and down the room. He probably imagined that I had come to him to confess my wrongdoings, and he probably expected that I should begin begging him to forgive my sister and me. I was cold. I was shivering as though I were in a fever, and spoke with difficulty in a husky voice. "And I beg you, too, to remember," I said. "On this very spot I besought you to understand me, to reflect, to decide with me how and for what we should live. And in answer you began talking about our forefathers, about my grandfather who wrote poems. One tells you now that your only daughter is hopelessly ill, and you go on again about your forefathers, your traditions. And such frivolity in your old age, when death is close at hand, and you haven't more than 5 or 10 years left." "What have you come here for?" my father asked sternly, evidently offended at my reproaching him for his frivolity. "I don't know. I love you. I am unutterably sorry that we are so far apart. So you see I have come. I love you still, but my sister has broken with you completely. She does not forgive you, and will never forgive you now. Your very name arouses her aversion for the past, for life." "And who is to blame for it?" cried my father. "It's your fault, you scoundrel!" "Well, suppose it is my fault," I said. "I admit I have been to blame in many things, but why is it that this life of yours, which you think binding upon us two, why is it so dreary, so barren? How is it that in not one of these houses you have been building for the last 30 years has there been anyone from whom I might have learnt how to live, so as not to be to blame? There is not one honest man in the whole town. These houses of yours are nests of damnation, where mothers and daughters are made away with, where children are tortured. My poor mother," I went on in despair, "my poor sister. One has to stupefy oneself with vodka, with cards, with scandal. One must become a scoundrel, a hypocrite, or go on drawing plans for years and years, so as not to notice all the horrors that lie hidden in these houses. Our town has existed for hundreds of years, and all that time it has not produced one man of service to our country. Not one. You have stifled in the germ everything in the least living and bright. It's a town of shopkeepers, publicans, counting-house clerks, canting hypocrites. It's a useless, unnecessary town, which not one soul would regret if it suddenly sank through the earth." "I don't want to listen to you, you scoundrel," said my father, and he took up his ruler from the table. "You are drunk. Don't dare come and see your father in such a state. I tell you for the last time, and you can repeat it to your depraved sister, that you'll get nothing from me, either of you. I have torn my disobedient children out of my heart, and if they suffer for their disobedience and obstinacy, I do not pity them. You can go whence you came. It has pleased God to chastise me with you, but I will bear the trial with resignation, and, like Job, I will find consolation in my sufferings and in unremitting labour. You must not cross my threshold till you have mended your ways. I am a just man, all I tell you is for your benefit, and if you desire your own good, you ought to remember all your life what I say and have said to you." I waved my hand in despair and went away. I don't remember what happened afterwards, that night and next day. I am told that I walked about the streets bareheaded, staggering and singing aloud, while a crowd of boys ran after me shouting, "Better than nothing." End of chapter 19. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 20 of My Life, The Story of a Provincial, by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 20. If I wanted to order a ring for myself, the inscription I should choose would be, "Nothing passes away." I believe that nothing passes away without leaving a trace, and that every step we take, however small, has significance for our present and our future existence. What I have been through has not been for nothing. My great troubles, my patience, have touched people's hearts, and now they don't call me better than nothing, they don't laugh at me, and when I walk by the shops they don't throw water over me. They have grown used to my being a workman, and see nothing strange in my carrying a pail of paint and putting in windows, though I am of noble rank. On the contrary, people are glad to give me orders, and I am now considered a first-rate workman, and the best foreman after Radish, who, though he has regained his health, and though, as before, he paints the cupola on the belfry without scaffolding, has no longer the force to control the workmen. Instead of him I now run about the town looking for work. I engage the workmen and pay them, borrow money at a high rate of interest, and now that I myself am a contractor, I understand how it is that one may have to waste 3 days racing about the town in search of tilers on account of some twopenny halfpenny job. People are civil to me, they address me politely, and in the houses where I work they offer me tea and send to inquire whether I wouldn't like dinner. Children and young girls often come and look at me with curiosity and compassion. One day I was painting in the governor's garden, painting an arbour there to look like marble. The governor, walking in the garden, came up to the arbour, and having nothing to do, entered into conversation with me, and I reminded him how he had once summoned me to an interview with him. He looked into my face intently for a minute, then made his mouth like a round O, flung up his hands, and said, "I don't remember." I have grown older, have become silent, stern, and austere. I rarely laugh, and I am told that I have grown like Radish, and that, like him, I bore the workmen by my useless exhortations. Maria Viktorovna, my former wife, is living now abroad. while her father is constructing a railway somewhere in the eastern provinces and is buying estates there. Dr. Blagovo is also abroad. Dubetchnya has passed again into the possession of Madame Tcheprakov, who has bought it after forcing the engineer to knock the price down 20%. Moisey goes about now in a bowler hat. He often drives into the town in a racing droshky on business of some sort, and stops near the bank. They say he has already bought up a mortgaged estate, and is constantly making enquiries at the bank about Dubetchnya, which he means to buy too. Poor Ivan Tcheprakov was for a long while out of work, staggering about the town and drinking. I tried to get him into our work, and for a time he painted roofs and put in window panes in our company, and even got to like it, and stole oil, asked for tips, and drank like a regular painter. But he soon got sick of the work and went back to Dubetchnya, and afterwards the workmen confessed to me that he had tried to persuade them to join him one night and murder Moisey and rob Madame Tcheprakov. My father has greatly aged. He is very bent, and in the evenings walks up and down near his house. I never go to see him. During an epidemic of cholera, Prokofy doctored some of the shopkeepers with pepper cordial and pitch, and took money for doing so, and, as I learned from the newspapers, was flogged for abusing the doctors as he sat in his shop. His shop boy Nikolka died of cholera. Karpovna is still alive, and, as always, she loves and fears her Prokofy. When she sees me, she always shakes her head mournfully and says with a sigh, "Your life is ruined." On working days I am busy from morning till night. On holidays in fine weather I take my tiny niece (my sister reckoned on a boy, but the child is a girl) and walk in a leisurely way to the cemetery. There I stand or sit down, and stay a long time gazing at the grave that is so dear to me, and tell the child that her mother lies here. Sometimes by the graveside I find Anyuta Blagovo. We greet each other and stand in silence, or talk of Cleopatra, of her child, of how sad life is in this world. Then going out of the cemetery we walk along in silence, and she slackens her pace on purpose to walk beside me a little longer. The little girl, joyous and happy, pulls at her hand, laughing and screwing up her eyes in the bright sunlight, and we stand still and join in caressing the dear child. When we reach the town, Anyuta Blagovo, agitated and flushing crimson, says good-bye to me and walks on alone, austere and respectable. And no one who met her could, looking at her, imagine that she had just been walking beside me and even caressing the child. End of chapter 20. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. End of My Life, The Story of a Provincial by Anton CHEKHOV. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946.